My husband Daniel came home from the hunting trip the same as always, truck dirty, boots muddier than they needed to be, a cooler of venison in the truck bed, and that particular looseness in his shoulders that came from 9 days without cell service. He unloaded the truck and cleaned his boots on the doorstep mat and washed his hands at the kitchen sink. And I heard the water running from the next room and felt the specific comfort of a sound I'd been missing for a week and a half. The kitchen smelled like his coat, like cold air and pine and the particular wood smoke smell of the camp up near Elk Fork. He was home. That was all I thought. He was home and the house felt right again. He was in good spirits. He'd gotten a doe on the 4th day, seen sign of a large buck on the 6th that he was already talking about coming back for in December. He sat at the table and told me about camp, about the Kowalski brothers and their argument over the best stand location, about a tributary on the north side of the ridge that no one had fished in years. He ate his dinner and I ate mine, and the kitchen was warm and the windows were dark with October outside and everything was fine. And that was the last evening for a long time that I felt like I fully understood my own house. He picked up his fork with his right hand. It should mean nothing. I understand that it should mean nothing. But Daniel had always held his fork in his left hand tines down, the continental way, a habit from his grandmother, who came over from a village outside Cologne when she was 19 and never fully let go of the old country table manners. He'd been doing it for 23 years. Our son had gone through a phase of imitating it when he was small, carrying the fork wrong and eating too slowly and driving everyone at the table gently insane. It was just a thing Daniel did, unremarkable in the way that all the small private habits of someone you've loved for a long time become unremarkable part of the landscape of a person, invisible until it's gone. He picked up his fork with his right hand and ate his dinner, and said the stew was excellent, and asked if we'd gotten rain while he was gone. I watched him clean his plate. I told myself I was misremembering. That was the first thing I told myself, and the first of many things I would spend the next several weeks telling myself. People switch hands. He'd been using his right hand to grip and haul and cut rope and open cans all week in camp, and the muscle memory had drifted. It meant nothing. I poured myself a second glass of wine and let it go. But I started watching, not consciously at first. More like something in me had filed the discrepancy and begun monitoring, the way you track a sound in the walls, probably pipes, probably nothing, but some part of you is always listening. I'd catch him reaching for a glass and hold my breath until I saw right hand or left, which way the fork, the particular unconscious lean of his left shoulder when he reached past me for something on a high shelf. Most of the time it was fine, the right habits in the right places, and then something would be off quick, almost invisible, like a word mispronounced by someone who learned the language from a recording rather than from a mouth. He slept differently too. Daniel had always slept curled on his right side with his left arm under the pillow. In 23 years I had woken beside that shape enough times that it had become something fixed, like a law of the physical world, Daniel sleeping that way, the particular arrangement of him in the dark beside me. Now he slept flat on his back with both arms straight at his sides, and his breathing was slow and even and very deep, and his face was slack in a way that looked less like rest and more like absence. By the third night I had stopped finding explanations for it. By the end of the second week I had stopped telling myself to stop noticing. The conversation about the weather was the next thing. We were at breakfast, maybe 10 days after he got back, and I mentioned the frost we'd had the week before. He said something about the hard freeze, and then he used the word brumus. Just dropped it in, casual, the way you use a word you've always used. Brumus, meaning foggy, misty, relating to winter mists. I had to look it up later to be sure I'd heard it right. Daniel had never used that word in his life. I would have remembered. You remember a word like that. I didn't say anything. I watched him pour his coffee and I thought, brumus, and I filed it next to the fork. 3 weeks after he came home, I woke at 2 a.m. and the bed was empty beside me. I found him in the kitchen with the lights off, not at the sink, not at the refrigerator, standing in the center of the room with his hands at his sides. When I turned on the overhead light, he turned and looked at me, and then he smiled. It was Daniel's smile. I've known that smile for 23 years, but it arrived a half second late. There was a brief window of neutral face, and then the smile came, as if it had been assembled from the correct components and deployed in the correct order. He said he couldn't sleep. He'd just come down to think. He came back to bed, and he was warm and solid, and he kissed my temple and said my name, and his breath smelled like him, and I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe and counted the hours until morn. I want to tell you about Miller Oakes's dog before I go on, because I think it matters. Miller farms 3 miles southeast of us. His wife Ruth Ann called me in the second week of October. She was calling about the church rummage sale, mentioned almost in passing that something had gotten into their kennel 2 nights before and killed their shepherd mix. The state game warden came out and was quiet for a long time before he said anything. He said it looked like a large predator, possibly a wolf, though there hadn't been wolves in this county in living memory. He said the stride was unusual. He did not say how it was unusual. He just used that word and stopped talking. Ruth Ann said she didn't like the way he went quiet when he saw the tracks. There was no logic to connecting that to anything in my own house. I know that. I sat in my kitchen and I knew that. And then something in me drew a line between those 2 facts, and the line was there and I could not undraw it. I started watching Daniel more carefully after that. The food was the next thing. He had always been what my mother called a good trencherman, cleared his plate, sometimes the serving dish too, the kind of appetite that never embarrasses itself but is always quietly present. After the hunting trip he began leaving food, just a little, just the right amount to go unremarked unless you were counting. The meat specifically, he'd cut it into smaller pieces than he needed to and move them to the edge of the plate. At the end of dinner they'd still be there. He pushed them around with his fork without lifting them. I asked once if the venison had gone off. He said it was fine, it was good, and he put a piece in his mouth and chewed and swallowed and said, really good. I watched his jaw work, I watched him swallow. He didn't look at me while he did it. Then there was the week he started going outside after dark. Not far, just to the porch, sometimes the yard. I'd wake to the empty bed and go to the window and see him out there standing very still, looking toward the tree line at the back of the property. The first time I thought he was looking at something. The second time I thought he was listening for something. By the third time I had stopped trying to distinguish between those 2 things. He never stayed out long, 20 minutes, half an hour. He'd come back in and come to bed and be warm and ordinary, and the next morning he'd be entirely himself, the same man who made good coffee and remembered to call his mother on Sundays and fix the fence in the back pasture without being asked. Almost entirely himself. The night in October, the cold one, I woke at 3 for no reason I could name. No sound, no dream. I went to the window. There was a wolf at the edge of the property, standing at the place where the gravel drive meets the grass. Large, very large. The porch light barely reached that far, and the wolf was at the very edge of the light, so I could see its outline clearly and the brightness of its eyes where the light caught them. It was looking at the house. It was standing very still and looking directly at the house. I stood at the window and I thought, very deliberately, look for the tail. I looked. I looked at the hindquarters, at the space where a tail would hang. The angle wasn't good. The light was poor at that distance. I stood there long enough for the cold from the glass to move into my face and my hands, and I could not make out a tail, and I also could not make out the absence of one with any certainty. I told myself the angle was wrong. I told myself that a wolf's tail held low can be nearly invisible against the hindquarters in bad light. I turned back to the bed. Daniel was in it, flat on his back, arms at his sides, very still. I went to his side and touched his shoulder, and he murmured and shifted, and his hand moved toward mine, and it was warm, ordinary warm, 23 years of warm. The nail of his left index finger had something dark underneath it. I pulled back before I understood that I was pulling back. He'd already settled back into sleep. I stood beside the bed and looked at him, and then I went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark and stayed there until the sky changed. I looked things up. I am not proud of the hour at which I did it, or the things I typed into a search bar at 4 a.m. in a dark kitchen. I read about the old ways of identifying a suspected person, the specific marks, the unibrow, the curved nails, the quality of the gaze, and then I read about something else, a growth found under the skin, pressed flat against the underside of the flesh, growing inward rather than outward, coarse, grey, present the whole time, just beneath the surface. Not something that arrived and changed you, something that had always been there, waiting, and that the right conditions brought to light. The old accounts say you cut the skin not deeply, just the outer layer, and there it is. I put my phone face down on the table. I thought about his grandmother, the village outside Cologne, the stories she told him as a boy, old country thinking, he'd called it, said with the faint embarrassment of a third-generation man who half believed things he wouldn't admit to half believing. He'd mentioned the stories a handful of times over the years. I'd never asked what the stories were. It had never seemed like something I needed to know. I thought about the word brumus, about the fork, about the way he'd looked out at the tree line 3 nights in a row. There is a hardware store in town, the kind that still sells hunting knives from a case near the register, good ones with full tang blades and walnut handles. I drove past it 4 days ago and sat in the parking lot for about 15 minutes. The store was open. I could see the lights inside and a man behind the counter reading something. I sat there and I thought about what I would say when I went in, what reason I would give, whether I needed a reason. Then I drove home. He'll be awake soon. I can hear him moving upstairs, the same creak of his side of the bed, the same weight of his foot on the floor above the kitchen. Sounds I've been reading without knowing I could read them for my entire adult life. He'll come downstairs and smile and pour his coffee, and he'll be warm and familiar, and I'll watch his hands on the mug, and I'll watch his left hand with the dark nail, and I will not say anything, because I don't know what I would say, and I don't know what I would do with whatever he answered. I don't know which answer I'm more afraid of, the one that confirms what I've been thinking, or the one that proves I've been sitting in my own kitchen, in the dark, building a monster out of a man who held his fork differently and learned a word I didn't know. I don't know which of those two things would be worse to find out. The coffee is done. I can hear him at the top of the stairs. Thomas had farmed the property for 11 years, long enough to know its rhythms the way he knew his own breathing, the particular way the northwest field drained after heavy rain, which sections of fence the deer always pushed first, where the soil changed character at the border between the upper and lower pastures. He was a methodical man. He kept a record book with columns for weather, yield, expenditure, repairs needed. He'd had 3 good harvests and 2 difficult ones, and had logged each with the same careful neutrality, as if weather was something that could be improved by accurate observation. He lived alone, had for 6 years, since his wife had taken their daughter south to live near her mother. He didn't speak much of it. It was simply a fact of the place now, like the forest at the back edge of the property, dark and dense and reaching, present in every season, something you learn to stop looking at directly and accept as part of the landscape. The first morning, he thought he'd walked in his sleep. He woke in early November, a Tuesday, he remembered, because he'd meant to call the co-op about seed prices, and the floor beside the bed had mud on it, not a smear, boot prints, more or less, leading from the bedroom door to the side of the bed where he lay. His feet were bare and slightly grey with dried dirt. His left hand had a cut across the palm that had scabbed over in the night, the edges clean, the depth suggesting something specific rather than accidental. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hand for a while. He'd sleepwalked once as a child, after his father died. His mother had found him standing in the yard at 2 in the morning, staring at the barn. She'd said it was grief finding an outlet. He was not aware of any grief that currently needed an outlet, but he accepted the explanation: stress, poor sleep, the body doing what bodies sometimes do, and cleaned the floor and washed his hand and went on with the day. He did not write it in the record book. 3 days later, he woke with both hands dark with something he chose not to look at too closely. He stood at the kitchen sink and washed them for a long time, watching the water in the drain, and then he dried them and made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the property in the early light. The fields were frost white, the forest at the back was dark. Everything was exactly as it should be, and he stood in the kitchen with his clean hands and tried to think about the day ahead and could not quite get past the question of his hands. By the end of November, there had been 6 mornings like that. Not every night, sometimes a full week would pass and he'd wake clean and rested, and the relief of those mornings was so complete that he almost believed the whole thing had been some brief strangeness the first cold brought on. But the pattern had enough weight now that he could feel himself waiting for it, could feel his own attention shift when he came awake in the dark and reached, before anything else, for his hands. Something else had been changing. He noticed it first with food. He'd always been a simple eater, practical, food as fuel, but he'd had preferences, things he reached for without thinking. He stopped reaching for them. The refrigerator was full of things he'd bought out of habit and now didn't want. What he did want, he couldn't quite name, and when he tried to think about it directly, the thought slid sideways, like something under ice. He stood in the grocery store on a Thursday and couldn't explain to himself why he'd picked up what he'd picked up and put back what he'd put back. He drove home with a bag he hadn't quite intended to buy and stood in the kitchen looking at the contents for a long time. The cold stopped bothering him. He noticed this in the second week of December, when he went out to check the lower fence wearing just a flannel shirt and walked the entire quarter-mile section before registering that he wasn't cold. He stood in the kitchen afterward and saw his own breath in the air and thought, that should have been uncomfortable. He couldn't remember why it had been. He was sleeping differently, too deeply, too completely. He'd set an alarm for 5:30 and wake at 5:30 with no memory of the alarm sounding, no grogginess, no slow return to awareness. Just asleep one moment and then completely, entirely awake the next, as if the night had been edited. He started taking different routes on his evening fence check. This was the thing he kept coming back to, later. Not the hands, not the cold, the roots. He'd been walking the same circuit for 11 years, a habit so ingrained he could do it in the dark, and sometimes did. But in November he began finding himself at the back edge of the property, near the tree line, without any clear memory of deciding to go there. He'd stand at the boundary between his land and the forest and look in. The trees were dense there, old-growth pine that blocked the last evening light almost immediately. There was nothing to see. He'd stand anyway. 5 minutes, sometimes 10, looking into the dark between the trunks. The tree line had a smell in winter. He'd never noticed it before. He noticed it now, something animal beneath the pine resin, something old and specific, and when he breathed it in, something in his chest responded in a way he didn't have a word for. Not fear, something older than fear, something that recognized the smell the way a thing recognizes the smell of its own place. He started locking the back door before bed. He didn't examine why. The morning he pressed on his own arm was a Thursday in mid-December. He'd been washing the breakfast dishes and noticed a tenderness on the inside of his left forearm, not a bruise, nothing visible on the surface, just a deep internal ache at a precise point about halfway between the wrist and the elbow. He dried his hands and pressed on the spot with his thumb. The ache sharpened. He pressed harder. There was something there. Not a muscle, not the bone. Something in the layer between, something that resisted pressure in a way that flesh does not resist, that shifted very slightly under his thumb in a way that flesh does not shift. Dense, present. He pressed again, and it was there again, patient and specific. He stood at the kitchen sink for a long time with his thumb pressed against the underside of his forearm. He told himself it was a cyst. He said the word aloud, cyst. The word helped briefly. It had a shape, a category, a clinical name. He made a mental note to have it looked at in the new year, and went about the day. That night he didn't go to bed. He sat at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and the back door locked and read a seed catalogue until dawn. In the morning he pressed on the spot again. It was larger, not dramatically, maybe the difference of a thumb's width, but he knew where the edge had been, and he could feel where it was now. It had moved to the right forearm as well, the same location, the same depth, the same quality of dense resistance, and something at the crest of his right shoulder, and a long thin trace of it running down his spine when he reached back and pressed with 2 fingers. He stood in the bathroom with his shirt off and looked at himself in the mirror and pressed along his own forearm and watched the skin depress without yielding what was underneath. He thought about the old word for it, what it was called in the accounts he'd been reading late at night on his phone in the dark kitchen, how they described the wolf fur as growing inward, not outward, pressed flat against the underside of the flesh, present from the beginning, waiting for the right conditions to become undeniable. Not something that arrived and changed you, something that had always been there. He went to the tree line that evening, deliberately, on purpose, with no tool and no fence to check, and no reason he could explain to himself. He walked to the back of the property at dusk and stood at the boundary and breathed the smell in the animal smell beneath the pine, the old specific thing, and felt the thing in both arms respond to it. A low resonance, a recognition that bypassed thought entirely. He had been here before, at night, on the nights he couldn't account for. He stood there for 20 minutes and then went back to the house and washed his hands and stood in the kitchen and looked at his palms. He turned them over. He pressed on his left forearm with his thumb and felt the thing there, patient and dense and growing, and he thought about what it would mean to cut just the skin, just the outer layer, and see. He thought about what he would find. He thought about whether he already knew. He put his hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time, studying his own palms the way you'd study a map of somewhere you've never been, but somehow recognize anyway. The kitchen was quiet. The frost was forming on the window. The forest at the back of the property was dark in the way it was always dark, patient, waiting, deeply indifferent. He went to bed. He locked the bedroom door from the inside and lay flat on his back, with his arms straight at his sides, and stared at the ceiling until sleep took him. He didn't dream, or if he did, he didn't remember it. In the morning his hands were clean, and the bedroom door was still locked, and the window beside the bed was open 4 inches. He didn't remember opening the window. He stood and looked at the open window in the cold morning air, and then he went to make coffee, and he pressed on his left forearm while the water boiled, and the thing was there, and it was still growing, and it was patient in the way that things are patient when they understand that they have already won. I found the first fragment in a bound collection at the Stadtarchiv in Cologne, misfiled under a land dispute from 1603. It was paper, not vellum cheaper, produced in haste, and the notarial hand was inconsistent across the page, as if the scribe had been interrupted or had chosen not to attend to his usual precision. The paper had been folded twice, and at some point unfolded and refolded differently, as if someone had intended to burn it, and then decided against it, and filed it somewhere it would not easily be found. The collection bore no title. The box was labelled, in a much later hand, Divises. Sachen ohne Ordnung, miscellaneous things without order. I had been looking for records of a trial mentioned in a footnote in a 1987 academic study of werewolf prosecutions in the German-speaking territories. The footnote said only, Cologne District, K. 1591. Records reportedly ordered destroyed. Cf. The stump case for contemporary comparison. No surviving primary sources confirmed. The author had not pursued it. I had. My name is Anneliese Brandt. The man who appears in these fragments was named Georg Albrecht Brandt. He was, according to the parish record I found in Kerpen, the only document in any archive that uses his name without subsequently striking it out my ancestor in the 9th generation, and a Fragment, Werken na Mittelhordische. Partial notarial account, Cologne District, date damaged. The accused was brought before the panel on the morning of the damaged of October, in the year damaged, and was found to be in good health and full possession of his faculties, and was asked to state his name and condition, which he did without hesitation. He said his name was Georg Albrecht, surname Damaged by Water, and that he was a farmer of the parish of Damaged. and that he was 31 years of age, or thereabouts. He was asked whether he confessed willingly, and said that he did. He was asked whether he had been offered any inducement, or had been subject to any duress, and said that he had not. He was asked, this panel being constituted to examine these particular matters, whether he understood the nature of the charges brought against him. He said that he did. He said he had been attempting to confess for 2 years, and had not been able to find anyone willing to hear it. The panel was asked to note that the accused had presented himself voluntarily, a Fragment 2 physician's testimony, heavily damaged, water staining and what appears to be deliberate scoring across several lines. The following passages remain legible. Examined the subject according to the standard procedure established for such cases, and found damaged consistent with the descriptions provided in the literature of damaged, including the matter of the discoloration at the base of the nails and the particular heaviness of the brow, which I noted but will not certify as definitive, as these features admit of explanation by ordinary means.
And last fifth wall.
Hold out the fifth wall. I examined the tongue. The accused submitted to this examination without resistance and without apparent embarrassment, and when I asked him to open his mouth fully and extend the tongue, he did so. I used the probe to examine the underside of the tongue toward the base, and I found damaged. I will say this: I have examined bodies for 30 years. I know what I have found. I know the difference between a cyst, a growth, a gland hardened with age, and what I found when I pressed the probe along the underside of that man's tongue. What was there was damaged by deliberate scoring. I am not willing to certify it in writing as what I believe it to be, because the consequences of that certification for the subject would be damaged. I will certify only that the examination was conducted, that it was not ordinary in any way I can easily account for, and that I recommend the remainder of this page has been removed. This is where the research became difficult. The physician was named in the notarial account. His name appears in the margin of Fragment I, added in a different hand at a later date. I searched for his records for 3 weeks. I found his death registered in the Cologne parish records in 1592, less than a year after the trial. The cause was listed as Erkrankung illness, common enough entry. There was a note beside it in a cramped second hand, kein Nachfolger, no papers following. I asked the archivist whether that notation was standard. She said she had not seen it before. A Fragment 3 letter incomplete. The salutation and signature have been removed, cut cleanly with a blade. The handwriting is different from the notarial hand, formal, administrative, the hand of someone who wrote many letters in a day. In the matter of the Brandt proceedings, I write to inform you that the panel has determined, following consultation with the ecclesiastical authority in Damaged, that the record of proceedings is to be treated as follows. The confession and any transcription thereof is to be surrendered to Damaged for destruction by fire, and a record of that destruction is to be kept and filed accordingly. The physician's examination and report is to be surrendered similarly. Notarial accounts, to the extent that they describe the content of the confession rather than its procedural form, are to be damaged. The reason given for this order is damaged, entire lines scored through with enough force to leave a groove in the paper. The accused is to be damaged. It is noted that the accused expressed no objection to any of the foregoing. It is noted that, when informed of the proceeding against the record, the accused said only, "I understand. I wanted someone to know. Someone knows now." This statement is to be considered part of the record, and is therefore also subject to Damaged. The trial record, to the extent it survived, does not tell me what Georg Albrecht Brandt confessed to. It tells me that he confessed willingly and voluntarily and without inducement. It tells me He had been trying to confess for 2 years. It tells me the physician who examined him found something under his tongue that he would not certify in writing, and that the physician was dead within the year. It tells me the records were ordered destroyed, and that the reason for the destruction order was itself destroyed scored through in that groove-cutting administrative hand before the letter was sent. And it tells me that when he was informed his words would be erased, his response was not despair, but something the second scribe, years later, would choose to preserve at personal risk. I wanted someone to know. Someone knows now. I have thought about that sentence a great deal. A fragment for marginal annotation, handwritten in the margin of what appears to be a later administrative copy of some court summary. The source document has not been preserved. Only this annotation survives, pasted to the inside front cover of the Dives's box, in a hand that has not been matched to any other document in the collection near. I was the second scribe at the proceedings of October. I was not permitted to keep anything from that room. I have kept this note in defiance of that prohibition, and I have hidden it where I believe it will survive. The man did not weep. He did not plead. He did not appear to be afraid. He said he had done things he could not account for, that there were mornings he woke and could not account for the preceding night, and that this had been happening for 3 years, and that the nights were not empty. He knew that. He could feel the weight of them. Something in him carried the knowledge of what they contained. He simply could not see into them directly. He said he believed he was responsible for Damaged, and for the deaths of the 3 animals found in the south pastures of Damaged, and that he could not explain himself except to say that, whatever he had been in those hours, it had not felt, from the inside, like himself. He was asked if it was not yourself, then who was it? He said it was myself. I know it was myself. That is the thing I cannot carry any more. There is one more fragment. I have saved it for last because I do not know what to make of it. It is a single sentence, written on a small torn piece of paper, in a hand I cannot match to any other document in the box. It may not be from the Brunt proceedings at all. It was tucked inside Fragment I when I first unfolded it. The paper is old, but I have not had it tested separately. It says, Die Borsten waren grau. The bristles were grey. I have had the main documents authenticated. The paper and ink of the notarial fragments are consistent with late 16th century production. The letter is possibly a contemporary copy rather than an original. The annotation may be contemporary or may have been written within a generation of the events it describes. I have been living with these fragments for 4 months. I know Georg Albrecht Brandt's handwriting from the one document where it appears his mark in the land register at Kerpen, a careful signature for a man who must have taught himself letters later in life. I have looked at that signature more times than I can count. I look for myself in it, the way you look at old photographs of family members for the angle of the nose, the set of the jaw. I know that he walked into a notary's office in the autumn of 1591 and said he had been trying to confess for 2 years. I know that whatever he confessed to, the people who heard it decided that the record of it was more dangerous than the man himself destroyed the words, burned the physician's report, scored through the reason for the order, and let him go back to his parish. I know, he said. I wanted someone to know. Someone knows now. I think about what it cost to carry something for 2 years with no one to tell. I think about the relief that might come from finally setting it down, even if the setting down changed nothing practical, even if the nights continued. The accounting of it, the naming. I have not had my tongue examined. I tell myself that is caution. I tell myself there would be no reason to. I am aware that Georg Albrecht Brandt told himself something similar, presumably for 3 years. I am aware that he eventually stopped. I have his name. I have his handwriting. I am told by people who knew my grandmother that I have the same particular heaviness to the brow, a quality about the eyes that she called old-fashioned, without being able to say what she meant by it. I have not walked into any offices. I am aware that is a decision I am continuing to make. The first morning I woke beside the river. I thought I had fallen asleep walking home from Genislus's barn, which would not have been the strangest thing that had ever happened to me. It was early autumn, and I was 22, and sometimes in those days the line between the end of a night and the beginning of a morning was not as clear as it might have been. But my boots were gone, and there was blood on my hands, dried in the creases of my palms, and it had been there long enough that it had gone dark and was beginning to crack. I washed my hands in the river and walked home without my boots on the cold ground, and said nothing to anyone about it. The second time, 3 weeks later, I woke at the edge of the forest half a mile north of the house, with no memory of how I had gotten there. The night had gone somewhere I could not follow. I lay on my back in the cold grass and looked at the sky, which was beginning to lighten at the edge of the trees, and I had the distinct feeling that something in me had returned from somewhere I was not meant to go and had not yet fully settled back into the right shape. My body felt borrowed. My hands were clean this time, but they did not feel like my hands. I told myself it was a sickness. I told myself it would pass. It did not pass. I want to explain how I came to know Thies before I explain what Thies told me, because otherwise the telling is out of order and the order matters. He was known in the district, an old man, very old, in the way of people who have lived so long that age has become a fixed condition rather than a process, as if they stopped changing sometime in their 7th decade and simply remained. He lived outside Kaltenbrun, a parish to the north of ours, in a house that sat back from the road at a distance that discouraged casual visitors. He had been there as long as anyone could remember. The older farmers spoke of him with a particular quality that I would now call careful respect, though at the time I read it as the ordinary deference given to age. The stories about him were old stories, stories that got told at a certain hour of the night after enough aquavit, and then got walked back in the morning. I had heard them the way you hear things in a community that does not fully commit to believing what it says half credit, held at arm's length. I had not gone looking for him. I want to be clear about that. I had gone to the market at Kaltenbrun to sell 2 geese and buy oil for the lamps, and I was coming back along the north road when the old man stepped out of a stand of birch at the side of the track and stood there in the road looking at me. He was looking at me the way wolves look at a man, not with fear, not with hunger, with assessment, a long, level, completely unreadable attention. His eyes did not move from mine. I stopped walking. I could not have kept walking if I had tried. Some part of me understood, in a way I could not yet name, that the appropriate response to this particular look was to be still. We stood like that for long enough that the light changed. Then he said, in the unhurried way of a man stating something obvious, "You have been waking in the fields." I said nothing. "You have been waking in the fields, and you do not know what happened during the night," he said, "and your hands are sometimes wrong in the morning." The road was empty in both directions. The geese I'd sold were gone, and the oil was in my pack, and there was nothing to do but stand there while the old man watched me with that level wolf's attention and said things he should not have known. "Come," he said, "walk with me a little." He did not hurry. He walked the way very old men walk who have made peace with their pace, unhurried not from infirmity, but from a settled relationship with time. I walked beside him, and the light came through the birches at a low angle, and I waited for him to say whatever he was going to say. He said, "When did it begin?" I told him. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded once, as if I had confirmed something he'd already known. "And what do you think you are?" he asked. I said I didn't know, which was true and also not true. I had heard the same stories he must have grown up hearing. I had given them the same half credit. Now I was giving them more. He stopped walking and turned to look at me. The wolf's look again, direct, level, without the slight deflecting quality that ordinary human eye contact has, the small unconscious agreements we make not to look too directly at each other. He looked at me the way a wolf looks at something it is trying to understand, with full and patient attention. "Good," he said. "It is better not to flinch from the name." What he told me was not what I expected. I had expected something like the accounts I'd heard: the curse, the damnation, the transformation as punishment or corruption, the thing that takes a man and hollows him out and uses what remains. What he told me was different. He talked about it the way a man talks about a difficult trade or an inherited piece of land, something that came with obligations, that required understanding, that could be done well or done poorly. He said the wolf was not separate from him. He said it was the part of him that could go where he could not, in the form he wore in daylight, and do things that could not be done in that form. He said, "When you wake in the fields, you have been working." I asked him what we worked at. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the birches the way he had looked at me, that same full patient attention. "Against things," he said, "that move through the dark hours and take from the harvest and take from the animals and take from the children when the children are left unwatched. You know these things by their effects. You wake from the fight with blood on your hands and you do not know whose blood, but the morning is clear and the cattle are safe and the harvest is where it was. That is the accounting." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It would make a simpler story to say I felt relief. An explanation, a framework, a community, the old man's calm pride in what he was, offered to me as a way of understanding what I apparently also was. I did not feel relief. I felt the particular unease of a door opening onto something much larger than you expected the room to contain. I felt the ground shift in the way it shifts when you discover that the thing you feared is not what you feared, that it is stranger and older and does not require your fear or your acceptance, and will continue regardless of what you decide about it. "How long?" I asked. He understood the question. "I am 81 years, he said. "I have been walking the fields since I was younger than you. I have done this for 60 years and I know what I have done, and I am not ashamed. I will tell the court the same if anyone asks." He said that last part with a directness that gave me pause, as if he had considered the court, as if he had already composed what he would say. "Do you know what you are, fully?" he asked me then. I said no. "Good," he said again. "That is correct. If you believe you know it fully, you will be wrong, and being wrong about this particular thing is costly." He began walking back the way we had come. "You will learn. You will wake in the fields less confused. You will begin to carry some memory of the nights, not all, but some. It will become not ordinary, but known." I asked him, "Does it stop?" He looked at me again. That same look, patient, level, wolf through a man's face. He held my eyes for long enough that I felt something in my chest respond to the attention, something that recognized the regard in a way I could not explain and did not try to. "No," he said simply. "It does not stop, but you will stop wanting it to." I have thought about that conversation for 30 years. I am not going to tell you whether what he said was true. I am not going to tell you what the mornings have been like, or what I carry from the nights now, or what I have come to understand about the accounting he described. That is not the part of the story that belongs to anyone else. What I will tell you is this. Thies of Kaltenbrun was brought before a court 9 years after I walked with him on the North Road. The magistrates questioned him about his nature and his practices, and he told them, by all accounts that survived, with perfect calm and complete conviction, exactly what he had told me. That he was a werewolf. That he had been one for 60 years. That he was not damned but was doing God's work, descending in the dark to fight what descended in the dark, doing what the man's body in daylight could not do. The court did not know what to do with him. The accounts record that the magistrates grew frustrated. They wanted a confession of sorcery and got instead a lesson in a theology they had no category for. They gave him a light sentence. They could not figure out how to condemn him for something he would not call sin. He died not long after. I was told by someone who had been there that he died without recanting a word. I still wake sometimes in the wrong place. I still carry the weight of the nights I cannot see into fully. The accounting he described, I understand it better now than I did at 22, standing on the North Road with my hands clean and my boots still missing. I am not going to say he was right about what it means. I am not going to say he was wrong. I am going to say that when a very old man looks at you with a wolf's eyes in the middle of a birch forest and tells you calmly that you have been working and will continue to work and that you will eventually stop wanting it to stop, that look does not leave you. Not in 30 years. Not in 60, I imagine. Not until there is no more waking in any kind of field. The following letters were found among the effects of one Tien Marchand Glinas, coureur de bois, following his failure to return to Trois-Rivières the spring of 1779. They were addressed to his wife, Marie-Claire Glinas, near Paquette. No record of the letters having been posted survives. They were discovered 30 years later when the trapping cabin at which he had wintered was found by a Huron hunting party moving south from the Livre watershed. The letters were bundled and tied with cord and stored beneath a loose floor plank alongside a set of account books, a crucifix, and one boot. The second boot was never found. October, year of our Lord, 1778. From the winter camp on the Livre tributary north of the outer ways. My dear Marie-Claire, I am settled for the winter now, and the cabin is sound. Tremblay patched the north wall before he left for his own lines, and I have enough wood cut for 3 months if the cold does not come early and hard. The river is not yet frozen, but it speaks the way it speaks before it freezes, a slow, low sound, something between running water and something more deliberate, and I expect another 2 weeks before the ice will hold a man's weight. The line looks good. There is sign of beaver and some marten in the birch stands to the north, and the weather has been clear and cold and honest, the kind that is comfortable to work in when you are dressed for it. The sky in this country is immense. I forget every year how much sky there is out here, and then I arrive and the city feeling the compressed feeling of streets and walls and people falls away, and there is only the cold and the trees and the enormous quiet sky. I am eating well. I sleep long and deeply in this air and wake rested, which is more than I could say for the sleeping I did in the city this past summer with the children noisy next door, and the street sounds from the Rue Saint-Pierre coming through the shutters all night. I think of you often. Tell the children I think of them too. Tell Henri to help you with the wood. Your devoted husband, Tien. 18 November, year of our Lord, 1778. My dear wife, something strange I want to tell you, though I do not want to alarm you, as it is likely nothing, and I mention it only because I am a man who records things. I have been sleeping very deeply. I noted this in my last letter as a good thing, and it still is, mostly. The cold and the work and the long dark nights press you down into sleep quickly and hold you there, and I have been grateful for it. But there have been 2 mornings now where the morning was not quite as I had left the night. The fire was built up when I woke, and I had no memory of rising in the night to tend it. This happens to men in deep cold country. You sleep so fully that the body moves and does what needs doing without the mind's involvement, purely from habit and the knowledge that a dead fire in this cold is serious. I have heard the same from Beauchamp, from Tremblay, from other men who winter alone up here. The body learns to protect itself. But there was also mud from the door threshold to my sleeping place on 2 separate mornings. The ground outside has been frozen solid since the 2nd week of November. I cannot explain the mud. My left boot was set by the door on one of these mornings, rather than beside the bed where I keep it. I must have gone out. I must have gone out in the night and gone back in and gone back to sleep and not remembered any of it. This seems like the explanation that fits the most facts. I am recording it because recording things is how I manage things I do not yet understand. I am well. Do not worry. Your devoted husband, Tien Marie. 3 December, year of our Lord, 1778. My dear wife, a trapper named Beausoleil passed through last week, heading south along the eastern edge of my line, and we shared a meal and some of his rum, and he told me something that has stayed with me. He said he had found tracks on the North Ridge 3 days before he reached my cabin, 4-legged, large, the stride of something heavy and moving fast. He was a careful man, Beausoleil, the kind of trapper who reads a track the way a notary reads a contract, nothing assumed. He said the tracks were not bear, and he said they were not wolf exactly, though they were closest to wolf in overall size and general pattern. He said the stride was wrong for a wolf. Not wrong, he said, close, but with something off in the placement, the weight distribution, the angle of the push. Something he had not seen before and had no name for. I did not tell him about the mud or the fire. I did not have a clear reason to connect the two things, and I still do not. I am writing this down because that is what I do, and because sometimes the act of writing down unconnected things allows the connection, in time, to become visible. It has not become visible yet. Your devoted husband, Tien Marie. 19 December, year of our Lord, 1778. Marie Claire. I have started locking the door at night. I brace the bar and I have added a cord tied from the bar to a peg in the wall so that the bar cannot be lifted without cutting the cord. I do this not because I believe there is something outside the cabin, but because I want to know in the morning whether the cord has been cut. I want to know whether whatever is moving in the night is moving out of the cabin or into it, or whether it is something internal, the body moving within the room and my mind simply not keeping pace. 3 mornings now the latch has been undone when I woke. Not the door was closed each time, cold, as if it had been shut for hours, but the bar was lifted from its bracket and resting against the wall, and twice the cord had been cut cleanly. The cord ends on the floor. The blade that cut them must have been sharp and deliberate. I do not keep a knife beside the bed. I am not sleeping well in the ordinary sense. I am sleeping deeply but waking with a kind of surface exhaustion that sits on top of a deeper rest, as if 2 different things have been happening during the night and only one of them belongs to me. I am recording this because I want to have a clear account of the progression of things, in case the progression matters later. I am eating. The line is good. The cold has been very cold but manageable. Your devoted husband, Tien Marie. 7 January, year of our Lord, 1779. My dear wife, 2 observations I want to set down while they are clear. First, when I wake in the mornings now, something is already satisfied. Not me, not exactly I am hungry in the ordinary way, cold, stiff from the night, but there is a layer of satisfaction underneath the hunger, a fullness at a different depth, as if something has eaten that is not precisely me but is not separate from me either. I wake and I feel the shape of that other fullness, and I cannot name it, but I can locate it, settled in the center of me, patient and complete. Second, I am tracking differently on the line. This is harder to put into words. When I am working, my attention moves ahead of my intention. I have already turned toward a sound or a scent before I have consciously registered that there is one. I turn and I am already turning when I decide to turn. Something in me is ahead of me, slightly, in the way a good hunting dog is ahead of you on the trail. I did not train this into myself. I do not know when it arrived. I have also stopped being cold. I mean this literally. I dressed for the cold this morning and went out and worked the north section of the line for 4 hours, and I was aware of the cold the way you are aware of the color of a wall present, noted, not felt. Not once did it reach me. These things are connected. I believe they are connected. I am going to write the word I keep not writing. I am going to write it once, here, in this letter that I have not posted and may not post. I think what leaves at night is something that lives in me and is not entirely me. I think it goes where it needs to go and does what it does and comes back before dawn and lies in the bed beside me and lets the warmth come back. I think the satisfaction in the mornings belongs to it. I think the cold no longer reaches me because some part of what I am has become accustomed to going out into the cold in a form that does not register the cold the way I do. I think Beausoleil's tracks on the North Ridge were mine, or were what I am when I am not this. I am going to write again soon. I am well. I do not know what else to say about it. Tien Marie. The following is undated. The handwriting is the same, but the pen pressure is inconsistent, heavy in some passages, barely legible in others, as if written at intervals, or by failing light, or by a man pausing often between sentences. Marie Claire. I need you to know that I love you, and that I am sorry for the spring, and for this winter, and for whatever comes of this winter. I need to say that first. Something leaves at night. I am certain of it now. I can feel the moment it goes a drawing down at the edge of sleep, a warmth going out of me like a tide going out, and then the sleep comes and takes the rest. And I can feel in the way you feel a weight returning to a chair beside you in the dark when it comes back. Before dawn, always before dawn. The warmth returns before I wake, and by the time I open my eyes, the morning is ordinary. I have tried to stay awake through the going. I have sat up with the lamp and I have fought the sleep with coffee and cold water and keeping my hands moving, and each time the sleep comes anyway, and comes as something I could not resist even if I had wanted to. Not a natural sleep, something that takes the mind first and leaves the body in the chair and then does whatever it does with the body while the mind is gone. I am going to try again tonight. I am going to try to see what I am in the dark before the mind goes. I am writing this first because if I do not write it now, I may not have the letter ends there. The remaining page is blank. A note appended in a different hand added by the Huron hunter who carried the letters to Trois-Rivières in 1809 and had them translated. Reads as follows. The cabin was warm when we found it. The fire had been fed recently. His provisions were untouched, his tools in their place, his furs bundled and stacked as if for a man expecting to return before nightfall. He was not there and has not been found. We found no tracks leaving the cabin in any direction in the snow around it, though the snow was fresh and undisturbed and should have held any track that was made. We found no tracks at all. Caleb Pruitt found it at the bottom of a wooden chest that had sat in the corner of his uncle's back room for as long as Caleb could remember. The kind of furniture that becomes invisible through sheer persistence, something you stop looking at because it is always there. His uncle had died in February without leaving instructions or much else of value, and Caleb had driven up from the valley to sort through what remained and do what needed doing, which in this family meant doing it alone. The chest held the expected things: a set of old tools, some papers, a Bible with the front pages filled in with names and dates in faded ink going back 100 years. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord that had dried and cracked with age, the belt. He unwrapped it on the table and looked at it for a while. It was made from an animal's hide. He could see that much, but the workmanship was not quite like anything he'd seen. The leather was dark, almost black, with a grain that didn't match anything domestic, and the surface had a quality that was hard to name, not quite rough, not quite smooth, something in between that his fingers kept registering as wrong. The buckle was iron and very old. It smelled like something he didn't have a word for, something between animal musk and deep forest, and something older than either. He set it on the table and went back to sorting. He left it on the table overnight without making any decision about it. In the morning he made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the mountain and thought about what to do. The chest and the tools and the Bible he would keep or give away as seemed right. The belt he would leave, not keep, not throw away exactly, just leave for someone else to find or not find. He drove back to the valley the following evening. The belt was in the passenger seat when he got in the truck, wrapped back in its oilcloth. He had not put it there and had no memory of packing it. He looked at it for a moment, and then he drove home. He tried 3 times in the first month to be rid of it. The first time he drove to the bridge over Harlan Creek and threw it from the center of the span and watched it hit the water and go under. He drove home with the window down and the cold air coming through and felt not relief exactly, but the absence of something he hadn't realized was pressing on him. He slept well that night. In the morning, the belt was on the kitchen table, not wet, not muddy, dry and wrapped back in its oilcloth. He stood in the kitchen and looked at it, and then made his coffee and went to work. The second time he built a fire in the yard, a proper fire, wood and brush, burning hot, and put the belt in the center of it and stood back and watched. The fire burned for an hour. He went inside and came back, and the fire was down to coals. He raked through the coals with a stick and found nothing. He went to bed satisfied, or as close to it as he'd come since the chest. In the morning, the belt was on the kitchen table. The third time he drove to a county he'd never lived in and buried it at the side of a logging road, deep enough that it would take real effort to find, in ground that had no particular connection to him or his family. He covered the spot with rocks and brush and drove home on a different road and sat in the kitchen and drank 2 fingers of bourbon and told himself it was done. He didn't check the kitchen table until morning. He didn't need to. After the third time, he stopped trying. He was not sure when that decision had been made. He didn't remember a moment of giving in. He just noticed, at some point in the second month, that he was no longer thinking about how to get rid of it. The belt sat coiled on the kitchen table, and he looked at it in the mornings and thought about other things and went about the day. The pressure he'd felt that first month, the urgency, the wrongness of it being in the house, had subsided into something that felt, if he didn't examine it directly, almost like ordinary fact. The belt was there. It was there the way the table was there, the way the mountain was there through the window. He kept the window at night. He noticed this without naming it for a while. He had always slept with the windows closed in cold weather, had always been a man who wanted the house shut against the dark. Now he opened the bedroom window before bed, not wide, just 4 or 5 inches, and lay down and slept, and woke in the morning with the cold air in the room and the feeling of something having passed in the night, some transit he hadn't been awake for. He didn't examine why he opened the window. It was just something he did now. His neighbor Clara Stinson mentioned the deer. She said it at the store in town, in the idle way of mountain people, reporting things without quite asking questions, a manner he had known all his life. The way information moves in a place where everyone knows everyone, and no one wants to appear too interested. She said something had been in the deer in the East Hollow. Not the season's hunting, not predator signs she recognized. The kills were wrong, she said. And then she said she had to go, and that was the end of the conversation. He stood in the parking lot afterward and thought about the word wrong and the specific way she had said it quickly, as if to get it said and move on, the way you say a word you're not comfortable using too many times. He thought about the East Hollow. It was on the far edge of his family's land. He had not walked out that way since February. He thought about the mornings lately, the particular quality of waking, not just rested but deeply fed, satisfied from somewhere he couldn't account for. He had been putting that sensation aside without examining it, because examining it meant following it somewhere he hadn't been ready to go. Now, standing in the parking lot in March with Clara Stinson's car already pulling out of the lot, he let himself follow it. The hollow, the deer, the night he could never account for. He had gone back to his truck and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he started the engine. He drove home and sat in the kitchen with the belt coiled on the table in front of him, and he pressed his hands flat against the table surface and breathed. He thought about what he knew about the belt. He had looked things up, carefully, without being sure what he was looking for, searching around the edges of the thing without approaching it directly. He had found enough. Old accounts, the kind that had been dismissed as superstition for so long that they had survived by becoming academically curiosity. The belt as mechanism. The belt as key. Not something that changed you, but something that allowed what was already in you to go where it needed to go, while the body remained behind in the bed, warm, breathing, apparently sleeping. He pressed his hands against the table and thought. The body sleeping while something else moved in the east hollow. He thought about Clara Stinson's face when she said the word wrong. He tried a fourth time. He drove to the county landfill with the belt in a sealed box and handed the box to the attendant and said it was scrap. The attendant nodded and carried the box away, and Caleb watched it go and drove home. He knew before he got in the house, he could feel it through the door. He stood on the porch for a long time. He put his hand on the door handle and left it there, not turning it, not going in. A bird in the high pines called once and then went quiet. The mountain was dark against the darker sky, and the air smelled like cold pine and something else underneath it. Something he had been smelling more and more these past weeks without being able to name it. Something that moved in his chest when he breathed it in. A low resonance. A recognition. He went inside. The belt was on the kitchen table. He cooked dinner and ate and washed the dishes and set them to dry. He sat at the table with the belt coiled in front of him, and he looked at his hands. They were the same hands he had always had. He pressed on the back of one with his thumb and felt what was there, the skin, the bones, the tendons, everything where it should be. He turned his hands over and looked at his palms. He did not look like anything different. He felt, in most of the ways that mattered in daily life, like the same man he had been in January. He reached out and picked up the belt and turned it over in his hands, the grain of it under his fingers, that quality he had noticed the first day wrong, not quite animal and not quite not. He had stopped feeling it as wrong. His fingers read it now, the way you read something familiar, the particular tactile fact of a thing you have handled many times. He put the belt back on the table and left it there. He went to bed. He opened the bedroom window the usual 4 inches and lay down in the cold and pulled the blankets up and looked at the ceiling. He thought about the East Hollow. He thought about what Clara Stinson's face had looked like in the store parking lot, that quick departure from the word wrong. He thought, it is still the same hands. He thought, it is still me. He was not sure, in the dark, whether that was reassurance or something else entirely. He closed his eyes, and the night took him, the way the night always took him now, completely and without warning. The day there one moment, and then gone, and then the morning, and the window still open, and the cold in the room, and the belt on the kitchen table where he had left it. Always there, always where he had left it. Patient in the way that things are, patient when they do not need to hurry. You want to know about Duad? Alright, I'll tell you. I'll tell you what I saw, which is different from what I know, and I'll tell you what I know, which is different from what I understood at the time. You got to separate those 3 things to tell a story like this one. Otherwise you tell it wrong, and the wrong part becomes the part people remember. I have been telling this story for 40 years, and I have still not told it entirely right. I do not know if anyone can tell it entirely right, because the heart of it is something you cannot put words to. Not the events, those I can describe well enough, but the particular quality of watching a man carry something he cannot put down and cannot name, and cannot ask anyone to help him carry. I will try again anyway. What I saw first was the hands. Duad Thibodeau had the hands of a man who had worked the water his whole life. Big, knuckled, not the kind of hands that did anything delicate. But that November, the November I am going to tell you about, those hands were not right. He would be talking to you, Duad would, and in the middle of the conversation his hands would start moving, and he would not notice for a moment. Not fidgeting, something more purposeful than fidgeting, something that looked like counting the fingers moving against the palm in a pattern, methodical, again and then stopping suddenly, going back to the beginning, as if he could not get past a certain point and kept having to start over. I asked him once, "Just your hands, what is that?" He looked down at them like he had not realized they were moving. He said nothing. Said it the way you say nothing when it is clearly not nothing, but you have decided not to say what it is. I let it go. That was the first time I let something go about Duard that November, that I should not have let go. You need to know something about the loup-garou before I can tell this story properly. Not the movie kind, the real kind. The kind we grew up knowing about in this parish. The curse does not come from being bitten. The curse comes from living wrong, from staying away from the sacraments too long, from making promises and breaking them in a particular way, from certain dealings that I will not name here, because naming them is its own kind of trouble. It is a punishment, but not the kind of punishment that is clean. The person knows, the person is still in there, fully, knowing everything that happens, remembering everything, and they cannot say a word about it. That is the cruelest part of it, not the transformation, the silence. Because if the loup-garou tells someone what they are, if they name it, if they ask for help, the curse becomes permanent. It cannot be undone anymore. So the person goes through the nights alone, carrying it, and cannot speak it to anyone who could help them, and they suffer through it and hope that someone figures it out and helps them in a way that does not require them to ask. The other thing you need to know, they cannot count past 12. Something in the curse does this to them. You scatter something in front of them, rice, seeds, buttons, anything, and they are compelled to count it, and they cannot get past 12 before they lose the count and have to start again. They will crouch there counting until dawn if you let them. Some people used to keep a jar of rice by the door. Duard's wife, Odette, had a jar of rice by the door that November. I saw it when I came to borrow her husband's net. I noticed it, but I did not understand what I was seeing. Not yet. The body things came after the hands. This is the part that is hard to describe to someone who hasn't seen it, because it is not visible exactly. It is in the quality of the movement, in the way a person occupies their own body. Duard had always been a solid man, settled in himself. He moved through the world with the weight and economy of someone who knew where all his parts were. That November he moved differently. Not dramatically, nobody who didn't know him well would have noticed. But I had known him 20 years and I noticed. There was something off in the way he held himself, a quality of maintenance, as if the ordinary way of being in a body now required conscious effort instead of habit. He would sit at a table and hold himself still in a way that read as effortful. He would walk, and occasionally his stride would be slightly wrong, corrected mid-step, as if his legs needed reminding about which length they were. He was exhausted, not the ordinary tired of hard work, the exhausted of someone who has been doing something strenuous all night, every night, and then has to get up in the morning and work anyway, and who is doing this while the knowledge of what he did during the night moves through his body like a bad fever that won't break. His eyes were wrong too. Not in the shape his eyes were the same eyes, but there was a film over the way he used them, a film over whatever he was thinking when he looked at things. Like there was a calculation always running just beneath the surface that had nothing to do with what he was looking at. I understood in December, not all at once, not a moment where everything became clear. More like a series of smaller understandings that accumulated until the full picture was there and I could not pretend I hadn't seen it. I came to the house one afternoon and found Duard on his hands and knees in the yard. He had a pile of something in front of him, beans, I realized, from the kitchen, probably a cup of dried beans spilled or placed on the ground, and he was counting them, moving them one by one, his lips moving. He did not notice me come through the gate. I stood and watched him count to 12 and then stop, and then his face changed, something like bewilderment, or frustration, or an animal's confusion, and he went back to the first bean and started again. I watched him do this 4 times before he looked up and saw me. The look on his face in that moment. I have seen men ashamed. I have seen men caught in things they could not explain. That look was different from those things. That look was a man who wanted to say something, who could feel the words he needed in his chest, who understood everything that was happening and understood that I was beginning to understand it too, and who could not say the one thing that would make me understand the rest. The counting beans, the jar of rice by the door, the hands in the middle of conversations, the wrong way he moved in his own body. His mouth opened. He looked at me, and his mouth opened. He closed it. He got to his feet and gathered the beans and went inside. I want you to understand what that silence cost him. I could see it costing him in December, in January, in February, the silence as a physical thing, as something he was carrying in his body the same way he was carrying the transformations and the nights and the count to 12 that never got further than 12. The silence was one more way the curse was living in his flesh. People talk about curses like they are things that happen to you. This one was a thing that lived inside you. It was eating him from the inside, and he could not even say that it was happening. His wife Odette knew. I understand now that she had known for a while the jar of rice was Odette's doing, something she'd read about or been told about, something she was doing quietly to help him through the nights when she could. She did not speak of it either, not because the curse bound her, but because speaking of it meant acknowledging what was true, and acknowledging what was true meant figuring out how to help him without him asking, which is the particular and terrible requirement of the loup-garou situation. You have to help without being asked. You have to draw blood without knowing that you're doing it. The curse releases when the cursed one bleeds because of something that was not intended as help. Odette was a patient woman. I do not know what she arranged or how she arranged it, and I have never asked, and she has never said. I know that in March, Duard cut his hand on something, a wire, or a nail, some ordinary piece of farm carelessness, and whatever happened between that moment and the weeks that followed, he was different after. The film behind his eyes cleared. He moved in his body again the way he used to move. His hands were still. He never mentioned that November in my presence, not once, in the 30 years after, until he died. What I will tell you, what I carry from this, what has stayed with me, is the silence. Not the counting, not the wrong way he moved, not even Odette's jar of rice that I was too slow to understand. The silence. The moment he looked at me in the yard and his mouth opened and then closed, the words he had and could not give me. The fact that he understood everything more than I did, more than Odette did, more than anyone, and none of that understanding could move from him to us without destroying the last chance of help. I think about what that is like, to know exactly what is wrong with you, to have the language for it, to feel the correct sentence sitting in your chest, ready, and to know that saying it will take away the only remaining possibility of ending it. So you do not say it, and you go home, and you get up in the morning, and you move through your life carrying everything, and you count your 12 beans, and you start again. That is what Duard couldn't say. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. The following journal was kept by one Alasdair Morrison, shepherd of the Glencarra estate, Sutherland, from approximately 1821 to 1823. Morrison was described by his employer, Mr. James Carra, as a reliable and sober man, not given to the sort of fancies common to those who spend long seasons alone in the hill country. The journal was preserved among the estate papers and passed eventually to the keeping of Morrison's granddaughter, who provided a copy to the collector of Highland folklore oral traditions from whom this text derives. 14 September, a wolf on the East Ridge. Not close, I had the glass on it, and it was a good distance above the flock, but I watched it for an hour, and it did not move toward the sheep. It sat above the tree line and watched down the glen, in the way a man watches a valley from a high place, surveying rather than hunting. I have not seen a wolf in this glen in 9 years. They were taken out of the Highlands before I was born, mostly, but something persists in the deep country. I have heard of them further north. This one was large. I noted the eyes when I had the glass on it, pale, nearly colorless in the afternoon light. The way it held itself was wrong for a wolf. I do not know another way to say it. It was still in the way a man is still, not in the way a wolf is still. It was gone when the light went. 22 September. It was at the river this morning, the east tributary, where the ford is low enough to cross in September. I was bringing the ewes down from the upper pasture, and it was standing in the shallows on the far bank, and it turned and looked at me, and I stopped walking. It did not run, it did not lower its head or raise its hackles or do any of the things a wolf does when it is deciding about a man in its territory. It stood in the water and looked at me with those pale eyes, and we were there together for long enough that the ewes settled and started grazing as if nothing was wrong. Then it turned and went into the birches on the far bank, and I did not see it again that day. I am a sober man, and I will not write down what I thought I saw in those eyes. I will write down that the thought came, and I pushed it away, and I have been pushing it away all evening. 80 September. It spoke. I have written that sentence, and I am going to leave it there and write what happened, because that is why I keep a journal, to record what happens, not what I understand. I was at the river alone, filling the water barrel, early morning, mist on the water. The wolf came out of the birches on the opposite bank and stood at the water's edge. I stood up from the barrel. We looked at each other for a moment. Then it said, "Do you know me?" The voice was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of inhuman wrong, in the sense of impeded. The way a man speaks when something has happened to his throat. Something of the wolf's palate in it. Something that the sound had to work around. But the words were clear, and the sentence was a sentence a man would construct. I said I didn't know it. It said, "My name was Ian Gillies. I am from the village at the head of the glen. I have been like this for 3 years. I know the name. Everyone in this glen knows the name. Ian Gillies went into the hills 3 years ago to bring down a strayed animal and did not come back. His wife, Miri, waited the better part of a year before the parish accepted his death. His children, 2 boys and a girl, are being raised by Miri's brother now. The eldest will be nearly 12. I stood at the river with the empty barrel, and I thought about all of this, in the space of a moment, and then I thought, a man is dead, and what is in front of you is not a man, and I thought, and yet, "What do you want?" I asked. It told me what it wanted in the careful way of something that has rehearsed a speech many times, and is holding itself to the prepared words because the prepared words are all it trusts itself with. It wanted to know if Miri was well, if the boys were keeping up with their schooling. The eldest had been poor at letters, had needed pushing, and the wolf said this with something in its voice that I recognized as the specific helplessness of a father who knows he cannot push any more. It wanted to know if the youngest had grown strong. She had been a sickly child, born early, and there had been a worry in the first year that she would not make it through the winters. It wanted to know these things. That was what it asked for. Information it could not get itself, because it could not go to the village, and because the one person in the world it might ask had been told it was dead. I answered what I could. Miri was well enough, remarried in the autumn, a decent man. The boys were in school, the girl had grown. The wolf was quiet while I spoke, and the quality of its quiet was the quality of someone receiving news they needed and could do nothing with. When I finished, it was still for a long time. Then it said, "Is there anything you can do for me?" I have thought about that question every day since. I knew what it was asking, not in the explicit form. It did not say, "Kill me," or "Free me," or "Bring a priest to this riverbank and have him perform what needs performing over a creature in wolf shape." It asked if there was anything I could do. It left the specifics to me. Perhaps because it didn't know what could help. Perhaps because it had been alone in the hill country for 3 years and had thought through every possibility and could not determine which one, if any, applied to it. I said I didn't know. It said, "I have been thinking about my children." I said I know. There was nothing else to say. I knew and it knew, and the river was there between us and the mist was burning off, and the morning was becoming ordinary in the way that mornings become ordinary regardless of what is happening in them. It went back into the birches. I filled the barrel and went back up the hill. 14 October. It came to the river again 4 days ago. I went to the ford on purpose, alone, in the morning. We had another conversation, shorter. It asked if I had thought about what it had asked. I said I had. It asked if I had decided anything. I said I had not. It said, I understand. It said this the way a man says it when he means, it is all right. And also, I knew this would be the answer, and also, underneath both of those, I do not know what I will do now, all three at once, in 2 words. I asked it what the nights were like. It said, I remember them. That is the main thing. I know everything that happens. I am present for all of it. I did not ask what all of it meant. I did not think I needed to. 22 October. I have been to the river every morning for a week. It has not come. I have been asking myself what I should have done differently, whether I should have gone to the minister, whether I should have found a way to bring what the wolf asked for, the last rites, the release, whatever the correct mechanism is for ending what should not continue to that riverbank, whether my not knowing how to help is sufficiently different from my choosing not to. I do not know the answer to that question. I have sat with it every evening in this house, and I have not gotten closer to an answer. What I know is this. A man who went into the hills 3 years ago asked me about his children, and I told him they were well, and he went back into the Birches, and I went back up the hill, and the world continued in its ordinary way, and the children grew, and Mary lives with her new husband at the head of the glen, and none of them know that someone who loved them was standing in a river 3 miles away asking a stranger whether the youngest had grown strong. I do not know what I should have done. I do not know what I should do now. I go to the river in the mornings, and I wait, and it does not come, and I come back to the house, and I write in this book, and the question sits in the center of my chest where it has sat since September, and does not become lighter, and does not become clearer, and the glen is beautiful in the October light, and the sheep are on the upper pasture, and somewhere in the hill country is a man who remembers everything. The following entry is dated approximately 3 months later, in a hand that appears more pressured, the letters larger than in previous entry. 10 January. The lambs on the east pasture this morning, 3 of them. It was done quickly and without waste, the way a skilled man does something he knows how to do, and it was not the way a wolf feeds. I went to the ford afterward and stood at the water's edge for a long time. I did not call out. I did not know what to call or what would answer, or whether what answered would still be the same thing I had spoken to in September. 3 months in the hill country in deep winter is a long time. Things change in deep winter. I stood at the ford and the water ran over the stones, and the birches on the far bank were bare and still, and I stayed until the cold was serious, and then I came back to the house. I am going to write down what I believe happened, and I am going to close this book. I believe Ian Gillies asked me if there was anything I could do. I believe the answer was that there was, and that I did not know what it was or did not have the courage for it. I believe he waited at the river in October, and then he stopped waiting. I believe the lambs this morning are what it looks like when a man stops waiting and accepts what he is. I believe I owe him a debt I do not know how to pay. I do not know what else to write. Something I found in my grandfather's papers about the Kessler wedding 1953. Not looking for validation, just want to write it out. No, this is probably the wrong sub for this, but the ones I found that seemed more appropriate had too much activity, and I wanted somewhere quieter to put this. I've been sitting on it for 3 weeks, and I need to write it out, or I'm going to drive myself insane. My grandfather died in February. He was 91, and it was not unexpected. I went out to Harlan County to help settle the estate, and I went through his papers, which he kept in a locked box in the back of the second bedroom closet. I expected what you find in those boxes: documents, photographs, letters, probably some financial things. I found all of that. I also found a folder. The folder had no label. Inside was a collection of handwritten notes, some clippings from the local paper, dated from the early to mid-1950s, and 2 photographs I have never seen in the family albums and cannot explain. The folder is about what happened to the people who attended the Kessler wedding in September of 1953. Some background. The Kessler family was one of the original farming families in that part of Harlan County. They'd been on that land since before the Civil War. In 1953, a Kessler daughter married a man named Albrecht, I think German immigrant stock. That part of Ohio had a lot of German families in the farming communities. The wedding was a community event, the kind of thing that apparently used to happen before everything got smaller, 3 or 4 dozen people, the church hall, a whole Saturday. My grandfather attended. Several of his siblings attended. My grandmother, who died when I was 6, and who I knew almost nothing about, attended. According to the local paper, everything was normal. Happy occasion, nice weather, names of attendees listed, the usual. The clipping is short and boring. My grandfather's notes are not short and not boring. Before I get to the notes, I want to establish that my grandfather was not a man given to imagination or record keeping in any dramatic sense. The box contained his tax documents, his discharge papers from the army, the deed to the farm. The folder about the Kessler wedding was the only thing in the box that was not purely practical. He kept it for 67 years and never mentioned it. He locked the box. The key was in his wallet when he died. He dated the notes, which helps. The first entry is from October 1953, about a month after the wedding. He writes, and I'm going to quote directly because I want to be accurate. Before I get to the notes, I want to establish that my grandfather was not a man given to imagination or record keeping in any dramatic sense. The box contained his tax documents, his discharge papers from the army, the deed to the farm. The folder about the Kessler wedding was the only thing in the box that was not purely practical. He kept it for 67 years and never mentioned it. He locked the box. The key was in his wallet when he died. He dated the notes, which helps. The first entry is from October 1953, about a month after the wedding. He writes, and I'm going to quote directly because I want to be accurate. Edit. Third time this week I've woken before dawn without knowing why. Not a sound, not a dream, just awake, and the dark outside different than it should be, and something in me wanting to be somewhere that isn't here. I've been having the appetite again, tried to pray about it, don't know what I'm praying for exactly. The appetite is mentioned several times. He never specifies what it is, only that it's wrong, not what a person should want. He writes once, without elaborating. He writes about his sleep changing, about going outside at night without knowing why, and finding himself at the edge of the back field looking toward the tree line. He writes about his brother Carl having the same things happen. He writes about going to see the Albrecht family, the groom's family, to ask about it, and being told by the groom's elderly mother, something he transcribes in his notes in a language I don't read. I took a photo and ran it through a translation app. It's German, and it translates roughly as, the binding was in the wine, and wine cannot be untied, but it can be managed if you know how. The photographs. I have to describe these carefully because I want to be accurate. The first photograph was taken at night. The quality is poor 1950s amateur photography in low light, but you can see a field, and at the far edge of the field, against the tree line, a group of wolves. I say wolves because I don't know what else to call them. Large animals, 4-legged, the right shape. Enough of them that I couldn't count precisely from the photograph, 7 or 8, maybe more. The wolves in this photograph have no tails. I have looked at this photograph many times in 3 weeks. I have adjusted the brightness and contrast on my phone. I have shown it to 2 people I trust without telling them what I was looking for, and asked them what they see. Both of them noticed the same thing I noticed, without prompting. no tails, not tucked absent. The hindquarters where a tail would hang are smooth. The second photograph is of the Kessler wedding party, taken during the ceremony, so probably 1953. Maybe 24 people in the frame. My grandfather is in it. My grandmother is in it, the first photograph I have ever seen of her. She is young and she is beautiful, and she is looking slightly away from the camera, toward the edge of the frame, and her expression is the one you have when you've just heard something that you're going to need to think about later. I have been going through my memories of my grandfather for 3 weeks. I knew him my whole life. He was a quiet man, a farmer, a church-going man. He was good to me. He used to take me to the back field in the evenings, and we'd stand at the fence and look at the tree line, and he'd tell me the names of the things you could see from there. Birds, plants, stars when it got dark enough. We stood at the back fence and looked at the tree line a lot, I realize now. I thought it was just a thing he liked, a farmer's habit. Now I am not sure. I also remember, I never once saw my grandfather eat meat from the table. He sat down with us and ate everything else and never made a point of it. When I asked once, he said he just didn't have the taste for it anymore. When I asked my father about it later, my father said he didn't know, that Grandpa had always been that way for as long as he could remember. As far back as he could remember started, I think, around the autumn of 1953. I want to be careful here because this is where it gets into territory that makes me feel like I'm losing my grip on what is real and what is pattern matching. My father has not eaten red meat in 20 years. He mentioned this to me on the phone last week in the context of a different conversation, and I felt my stomach drop in a way I could not explain, and I let the conversation move on because I did not know what question to ask. My father has 2 brothers. I don't speak to them often. I called the older one, Dennis, last week on a pretext and worked the conversation around to habits and health and eating, and he said in the same casual, unremarkable way my father had said it, that he'd lost the taste for meat some years back. Couldn't really say when. I have been eating meat my whole life. I am telling you this because I need to tell someone, and because stating it feels like it matters, and because the alternative interpretation of what I just said is something I am not ready to look at directly. Edit 1. Added approx. 11 p.m. same night. I went for a walk after I posted this, and I ended up at the end of my street standing at the fence where the neighborhood ends and the old Pritchard farm starts, looking at the dark field, just standing there. I don't know how long. I came back inside and my hands were cold, and I didn't know what I had been looking at. I'm going to leave this post up. I wanted to delete it, but I'm leaving it up. Edit 2. The following morning. I had slept okay. I want to say that because I was worried last night. I looked up the Albrecht family this morning. The Grooms family, the one my grandfather visited in 1953. There's an Albrecht farm still, about 15 miles from the Kessler property. The current owner is the groom's grandson, I think, based on the age. There's a number I could call. I'm not going to call. Not yet. I don't know what I would say. I'm also not going to go looking for the photographs my grandfather kept, the ones from the field. I took photos of everything in the folder before I closed it and put it back in the box, because I document things by instinct, but I have not opened those photos on my phone again. They are in there. I know the shapes in them. I know what is missing from the shapes in them. I think I'm going to leave it there for now. Edit 3. Several days later. I had a conversation with my father about his father's family history. Just a conversation, nothing unusual. I steered it carefully. I asked if he had ever noticed anything about the way the men in the family slept. He laughed a little and said why, and I said just curious, and he said his father slept oddly, always had too deeply, too suddenly, like he went down all at once, and his uncles were the same way, and he said still with the same easy casual tone that he himself slept that way, always had, out like a light, and then back in the morning with no in-between that he could remember. I said, do you dream? He said he didn't. He said he had never dreamed, or if he did, he didn't remember it. He said the nights were just gone. He was there, and then he was back. I said, that's interesting. He said, is it? I said, never mind. He is my father, and I love him, and I'm going to leave this exactly where it is and not pull on any more of the threads because I have enough threads already, and I do not need to know where all of them go. I do not need to know that. I'm going to close this tab now. The following accounts were gathered by the antiquarian Henry Desroches during his survey of village folklore in the Meuse department, conducted between 1887 and 1891. Desroches recorded oral testimonies and collected written statements from living witnesses and from the families of deceased witnesses. The accounts below describe events reported to have occurred at the churchyard of Saint-Lazare-sur-Aire during the years 1869 to 1873. Desroches notes in his introduction that he undertook the collection without prejudice as to interpretation, and with the acknowledgement that several mutually corroborating accounts from credible witnesses constitute evidence of something, if not necessarily evidence of the thing the witnesses believe themselves to be describing. Account of Philippe Bouchard, gravedigger, collected 1888. I've been digging in that churchyard for 30 years and I've seen everything that comes there. I'm not a man who frightens. The first time was in November of '69, a week after we buried old Clément. I was there early in the morning to check the yard after a hard frost. Sometimes the ground heaves and the stones shift, and you need to look before anyone comes for morning prayers. It was before light, just the sky going grey. There were 2 wolves beside the Fourier grave, not on it, beside it, lying down side by side like dogs that have settled in for the night. They looked up when I came through the gate, but they did not stand and they did not show their teeth. I stood there and they looked at me, and I looked at them, and then I went back out the gate and waited until light before I went back. When I went back, they were gone. The grave was undisturbed. That is what I want people to understand. In 30 years of graves, I have never had one disturbed by animals. But that is not what I expected to find after seeing wolves there. I expected damage. I found nothing except 2 impressions in the frost where they had lain, one on each side of the grave, both running parallel to it, as if they had been standing watch. I told the priest. He thanked me and said he would look into it. Account of Pre-Auguste Villeneuve, priest of the parish of Saint-Lazare-sur-Aire, collected 1887. Bouchard told me about the wolves in November of '69, and I confess I did not take the full report seriously at that time. Bouchard is a reliable man, but he is not a young man, and the grave business is strange work at strange hours, and I thought it likely he had seen dogs and interpreted them as wolves in poor light. I saw them myself in the spring of 1870, a fortnight after the burial of the Chabrier infant. I had gone to the churchyard at night for reasons of my own. There had been some small vandalisms, boys in the village, and I wanted to satisfy myself that the yard was orderly. I took a lantern. There was one wolf at the Chabrier grave, seated, not lying, and facing the grave in the way a person faces something they are looking at carefully. When my lantern reached it, it turned and looked at me. The eyes caught the light. I held the lantern and the wolf looked at me, and I looked at the wolf, and then it turned back to the grave. I stood at the gate for some time, I do not know how long. The wolf did not move again while I watched it. It sat with its attention on the grave in the way that I, and only I, in the ordinary course of my duties, sit in the presence of the dead. In the morning, the grave was untouched. I went into my records and I noted that the Fourier burial and the Chabrier burial were both of people who had died without receiving the last rites. Fourier had gone suddenly in the night. The Chabrier infant had not been baptized. These are notes I kept privately and have not before shared. Account of Geneviève Marchand, widow, collected 1889. My husband was buried in October of 1871. He died of a fever that came quickly, and I was not prepared. And after the burial I could not sleep, and I went to the churchyard in the middle of the night, because that was where he was, and I had nowhere else to go. There were 3 wolves at his grave. I know what that sounds like. I want you to understand that I was a widow in the middle of the night in a churchyard, and and I saw 3 large wolves at my husband's grave, and my first feeling was not fear. I have thought about this many times since, and I cannot explain it, but it was not fear. I sat down on the ground just inside the gate. The wolves were at the grave. One of them turned and looked at me for a moment and then turned back to the grave. The 3 of them stayed as they were. I stayed until the sky started to go light. The wolves left before dawn, slipping through the gap in the east wall one by one. They were large, much larger than I expected a wolf to be. I went to my husband's grave and put my hand on the ground, and it was cold and ordinary, and the dew was on the grass. I do not know what they were doing there. I know that while they were there I did not feel that my husband was alone. That is all I can say. Account of Thomas Girardin, age 11 at time of events, collected 1890. I saw the wolves from the window of my grandmother's house, which looks out over the wall of the churchyard on the south side. I saw them 3 times. The first time I thought they were big dogs. Then I saw them again, and I knew they were too big to be dogs. They always came at night and left before it was fully light. They went to the graves and they lay down, or they sat, and they didn't dig or scratch or do anything wrong, just stayed. I told my mother, and she said I had been dreaming. I hadn't been dreaming. One time I watched one of them sit at a grave for a very long time, and then lift its head and be very still and look at something I couldn't see from the window, in the corner of the yard where the old stones are. Then it put its head back down and stayed. I didn't know what it was looking at. There was nothing in that corner that I could see. I still think about the one that looked at the corner. I don't know what was in the corner. Account of Armand Petit, night watchman, collected 1888. I saw the wolves on 4 separate occasions between 1869 and 1873. I kept my own record at the time, which I still have. The dates correspond to new burials on each occasion, within 1 to 2 weeks of the burial. After 1873, so far as I know, the wolves did not come again. I noted the following things across my 4 observations. The wolves were never fewer than 2 and never more than 4. They did not fight among themselves. They did not appear agitated or afraid. They did not respond to sound from the village. On one occasion I deliberately made noise on the road outside and they did not react. When they chose to leave, they left through the east gap in the wall in an orderly way. I do not know where they went. I noted on each occasion that the graves they attended were those of people who had died in specific circumstances, suddenly, without preparation, in infancy, or without a priest present at the end. I do not know what weight to assign to this observation. I am only recording what I noted. On my 4th observation there was one wolf sitting alone at a grave, and it turned and looked directly at me for a long moment, and I had the thought, which I will record here because I am being thorough, though it is not the kind of thought I ordinarily put in a watchman's report, that whatever this animal was, it was sorry. That sounds like a foolish thing to say about a wolf. I have had 20 years to think of a better way to put it, and I cannot. Collector's note, Henri Desroches, 1891. I present these accounts without conclusion, as I said I would. 5 witnesses, spanning a period of 20 years. No consistencies in age, occupation, or temperament. No motive for fabrication that I can identify. The reported phenomena, large wolves at fresh graves, not predating but attending, leaving before dawn. Present only at graves of the unbaptized, the suddenly dead, the unconfessed. I have encountered in the older literature on this subject accounts describing certain wolves as figures of protection rather than predation, creatures who perform in animal form a kind of guardianship that the living cannot provide. These accounts are found in the Norse territories, in Livonia, in certain isolated areas of France. They are dismissed as superstition in most modern treatments. The Livonian accounts are perhaps the most specific, a class of figures described as the hounds of God, who descend at appointed times to undertake tasks in the lower world that ordinary men cannot perform, and who return before dawn. The graves of the unconfessed and the unbaptized feature prominently in this tradition as places requiring particular attention, places where the usual guardians cannot reach. I raise this not as explanation but as context. I am a collector of folklore, not a theologian or a naturalist, and my competence is in setting things beside each other and noting what they share. What these accounts share with each other is clear. What they share with the older literature is, I admit, more than I expected when I began this survey. I will only say that the witnesses I spoke to were credible. The accounts are consistent in their particulars, and the graves in question were, in each case, found undisturbed in the morning. I do not know what attends the graves of the unconfessed dead in the churchyard of Saint-Lazare-sur-Aire. I know that something did, for 4 years, on a pattern that follows no logic I can identify in the natural world, and follows a different logic that I am reluctant to name. The watchman, Petit, said the animal looked at him and he had the impression it was sorry. The widow Marchand said she did not feel her husband was alone. The child Girardin said there was something in the corner of the yard that he could not see but the wolf could. I have thought about these 3 statements and I remain uncertain what they add to each other. I only note that each of them, in their own way, describes the same fundamental wrongness, something performing a function that should not require it, something present at a threshold that something else should be guarding, something filling an absence that should not, in an ordered world, exist. I have left the question open. I do not expect it to close. The blood had been an accident. She had gone into the dark with a knife for the purpose of cutting a catch rope, and come back with the knife gone, and her hands red, and a certainty in her chest that she could not look at directly. Whether she had meant it or not did not change what happened afterward. Whether she had known what she was cutting at did not change the man who woke in the morning with no wound on his body, and no memory of the night, and a look in his eyes that she recognized from before the 3 years of the wrong eyes, before the wrong sleeping, and the wrong mornings, and the children growing up with something in their father that their mother could not explain to them. He was back. That was the only word for it. He was there behind his face again, the same man she had married at 17 and slept beside for 9 years, and lost to something she had no name for. In the winter he came back wrong from the high grazing. She could not tell him what she had done. She could not tell anyone. This was the rule, as she understood it, not from the priest, who would have no framework for such a thing, not from any books she had read, but from an old woman in the next valley, who had known such things the way old women in that country knew things, carried in the family the way useful knowledge is carried, generation to generation, alongside the remedies for fever and the names of the right plants for childbirth. The old woman had told her, 3 months ago, what to do and what the doing would cost. She had told her, "You cut the skin, and the blood is what breaks it. But the breaking is only the beginning. You say nothing of what you did for 100 days and 1 day after. You say nothing to anyone, not to him, not to the priest, not to your children, not to anyone who asks, and they will ask. If you speak of it in that time, the curse does not end, it moves. You say nothing, and you count your days, and you wait." She had asked, "What if I cannot?" The old woman had said, "You will find that you can, or you will find out what you cannot do." The first days were not hard. She was so grateful for what had come back to her, the sound of his voice in the ordinary voice, the way he sat at the table, the way he was present in the house, that the silence was easy. She did not want to talk about it. She wanted only for it to be over, for the days to run through and reach the other side, and the thing to be done and put behind them. On the 4th day she woke with a cut on her left palm, a clean cut, shallow, healed enough to be a day old. She had no memory of cutting it. She pressed the edges together and bound it with cloth, and told him she had caught it on the loom, which was the first lie, and it was an easy lie because it was plausible, and plausible things asked no questions. On the 9th day she woke with 3 parallel scratches on her right forearm, not deep, but deliberate in their pattern, 3 lines, spaced evenly, the spacing of a large animal's claws. She stood at the wash basin and looked at them for a long time. She bound them with cloth and wore her long sleeves. She understood what the wounds were. They were the record of what the wolf had done in the nights it had moved through the dark, the nights she had sent it back in memory, and the nights before that, the account written in her skin rather than his, the curse passing the record to her as the breaking began its work. She counted the days by notching a piece of wood she kept hidden in the chest where the winter wool was stored. Each morning she added a notch and ran her thumb along the row and calculated. 30 days and 1, 40 days and 6. The notching was the rhythm of the silence, something physical to set against the weight of carrying it. The weight grew, not from grief or fear exactly, from the pressure of a known thing with nowhere to go. A person could carry almost anything, she had discovered, if they did not try to set it down. The setting down was what broke you. As long as you held it, it was simply weight, and weight was a known thing, a manageable thing, something the body learned to accommodate. She held it and counted, and held it. He asked her once in the second month if something was wrong. He said it gently, the way he had asked things before, the way she had not heard him ask for 3 years. She looked at him, and the words were in her chest, all of it, the old woman and the knife and the night and the blood on her hands and the scratches on her forearm under her sleeve. And she said, "No, nothing. I'm tired. It's been a long autumn." He accepted it. He was not the kind of man who pressed. She went outside afterward and stood by the well and breathed for a while. In the 6th week she developed a limp. It came on a Monday morning, a deep lameness in the right leg, and by the evening she could put no weight on the foot at all. She sat with it elevated and felt the ache moving up through the leg and thought about the wolf's nights, the terrain it would have covered, the rocks and the hard ground, and the possibility of something going wrong in that dark country where it had been running for 3 years. The wolf's body had been his body, and his body showed nothing now. The wounds transferred, the record of 3 years, slowly, being written onto her. He brought her water and a blanket and sat with her, and she looked at his face and thought, "This is the accounting. This is what it costs. Not the silence exactly, but the silence while you carry what you carry, while the old thing finishes moving from where it was to where it will end up, and you cannot tell anyone what you feel in your leg or why, and you sit with it, and notch your piece of wood and count 61, 62. The worst night was in the 8th week. She woke from a dream she did not remember to find that both hands had gone numb to the wrist, a deep cold numbness that lasted until well into the morning. She lay in the dark and worked her fingers until the feeling came back, and she counted the nights she knew about, the nights in the first year when the hunting had been bad and the cold had come early, and she thought, he ran in that cold, and his hands paused. Something had gone numb in that cold, and she was carrying it now, 8 weeks in, the body insisting on its accounting. She had not expected it to be thorough. She had understood that the wounds would come. She had not understood how complete the record would be. She was not sorry. She wanted to be clear about that, in the privacy of her own mind. She was not sorry for what she had done, and she was not sorry for what the doing had cost her. She thought about the man asleep beside her who had woken a month ago, knowing himself for the first time in 3 years, and she thought about her children in the next room, who had their father back, the one they had stopped asking about because asking about it hurt. And she pressed her cold hands together under the blanket and felt them warming, and told herself, 79 days, 22 days and 1. Oh, she made it to 97 before she came closest to breaking. Her youngest 4 years old enough to remember the wrong father, and young enough not to have words for the memory, came to her in the yard and asked in the way small children ask things, directly and without preparation, "Mama, what happened to Papa?" She stood in the yard and looked at her child, and the whole of it rose in her. The knife and the dark and the blood, and the wolf's scream in the dark that she had not let herself think about, had been not thinking about for 97 days, the sound of what breaking a curse sounds like from the outside, and the old woman's face when she told her what to do, and the notches in the wood, and the wound on her palm, and the limp that had taken 6 weeks to go, and the numb hands that still sometimes came without warning in the night. Her child looked up at her and waited. She said nothing happened to Papa. Papa is well. Go and find him. Her child went. She stood in the yard for a long time with the yard very quiet around her, and then she went inside, and she counted. 4 more days and 1. On the 101st day, she took the notched wood from the chest and put it in the fire and watched it burn. She did not feel different immediately. She had half expected something to lift, some pressure to go that she had been carrying so long she had stopped feeling it as a separate thing from herself. But the morning was ordinary, and the fire was warm, and the wood burned, and there was nothing except the ordinary sounds of the house, and the smell of the fire, and the burn scar beginning on the inside of her left forearm, from a night in the 4th week that she had not yet let herself look at, and might never let herself look at entirely. She had broken a curse. That was the whole of it. She had broken it and paid the accounting, and the thing was done. She went to find him, and she put her hand in his hand, and she did not say anything, and he held her hand, and did not ask why, and they stood together in the doorway of the house while the morning went on in the way mornings go on, indifferently, and without acknowledgement, not caring what had been paid for this particular one. She counted nothing that. The first years, I thought it was a sickness. That is always what it seems like at first. You wake wrong, too rested in some parts and too exhausted in others, as if the body had been sorted into sections during the night, some sections given back to you in good order, and some kept for other purposes. You lie there and take inventory, your hands, your feet, the quality of the light and how far into morning the light has already gotten without you. You look for what you cannot account for, and you find it, and you think, there must be a name for this that a physician would know. There is no physician in this village who knows the name for it. I made inquiries, carefully. I learned to manage it. That is the word I use, manage, which means learn what you can and cannot control, and organize your life accordingly. I stopped sleeping near anyone who might notice the going and the coming back. I stopped keeping animals that might smell what I was in the dark. I moved to the edge of the village and I kept my own hours, and the village let me, because the village had always had someone like me on its edge, someone they did not ask too many questions of, someone they needed in one way and were careful of in another. I managed it for 11 years, and the night that ended the first part of my life happened in November. I am not going to tell the details of it, because the details are not the point, and the point is what came after. What I will say is this. I went out in the usual way, in the dark, in the condition I do not have a clean word for, and something went wrong in the way that things sometimes go wrong in the dark country, and when the morning should have come, it did not come in the way it usually came. There was a gap. Not the ordinary gap of a night I cannot remember. I am accustomed to that gap. I have learned to read its edges, to feel where it begins and ends, and what it cost in the crossing. This was a different kind of gap. I came back through it eventually, but the coming back was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the cold. I had been cold resistant for years. This is common. In my condition, the body's accommodation to the night work. The cold had become background. I registered it the way you register the color of familiar walls, present and noted and not felt. That had been a comfort of a kind, the cold not reaching me. The cold did not reach me on that first morning after, but it did not reach me differently. Not as background, as irrelevance, as something that had lost the category it needed to exist in, because the category that cold belongs to, the category of things that could potentially harm the living body, was no longer fully available to me in the way it had been. I stood in my house and I understood that the cold was not reaching me, because I was not fully available to be reached. I did not go out on the second night. I sat in the house with the shutters closed and the fire going. I still felt the heat of the fire, that much remained, and I ran inventory in the new way, the way I was learning. Not just my hands and feet and the quality of the light, the deeper inventory. What moved when I breathed, and how? What responded when I pressed my fingers to my own wrist? What the silence in the house sounded like without the particular small sounds I had always been able to hear in it before. For 11 years I had been learning to live inside a particular strangeness. You learn, you develop vocabulary for the things that happen to you, words you only use inside your own head because there is no one to say them to, and those private words become the architecture of how you understand yourself. I had a whole private language for the wolf's life. I had words for the going and the coming back, words for the hunger and the threshold and the gap in the nights. I had been fluent in it. I had none of those words for what I was now. I was learning a new language with no teacher, in the dark, with only the inventory and the fire and the quiet house. What I heard in the silence of the house on that second night was the village. Not loudly, not with any urgency, just present, the village breathing in the dark, the way a village breathes when it sleeps, specific, individual, 100 small sounds of 100 small lives, arranged in the dark at various distances, and my attention moving among them with an ease and a precision that was new. I sat with the fire and listened to the village breathing, and I thought about what I was inventorying. On the third night I was not in the house when the morning came. I did not decide to go out. That is what I want to say clearly, for the record that no one will read. I did not decide. There was a point at which I was in the house and a point at which I was not, and between those 2 points there is a gap, but this gap is different from the gaps I have known for 11 years. This gap is not empty. It has content. A kind of content I am still learning to read. A kind of content that feels less like absence and more like a different kind of presence, like a record kept in a system I have not yet learned to read in full. I came back to the house before dawn, came back to the house through the window. The window I had not opened. I stood inside and looked at the window, open from inside, and I thought about the difference between a latch lifted from the outside and a latch lifted from inside, about what it means to have entered a house and then found yourself already inside it, about the window, specifically the window, opened from inside, in the dark, by something that wanted in. I was inside. The window was open from inside. I have been cataloguing the differences for 3 weeks now, in the way I catalogued the first changes 11 years ago, methodically, without panic, because panic is not useful, and I am a methodical person. The things that are the same, I still think, I still have words for things. I still know my name and the name of this village and the names of the people in it, which is more than I want to know now about the people in it. I still have memory, though the memory now has a new layer on top of it, the layer of the third night and what came after, which I am still reading. The things that are different, the cold, as I said, the hunger. The hunger is different in a way that I am not yet ready to describe in any detail, except to say that it is more specific than it was, and more patient, and it knows what it wants in a way that the old hunger, the wolf's hunger, did not quite know. The wolf's hunger was broad. This hunger is particular. The dark is different. The dark is less of an obstacle and more of a medium, something I move through, rather than something I move in spite of. The village in the dark is very clear, individual, named if I think about the names. I am trying not to think about the names. The old accounts I have read them, in the 11 years I have had to read them, the accounts in the old books about what I was and what I might become, speak of this as a transition, not an ending. The wolf dies and what was in the wolf continues, in a different arrangement, with different requirements. The accounts are consistent on one point. What continues is not less than what was before. In some ways it is more patient, more durable, less troubled by the things that troubled the living, the cold, the light, the hunger for ordinary things, the need for sleep that left you helpless for 8 hours in every 24. I do not sleep anymore. This is new. I lie in the house at dawn and the light comes through the shutters, and something in me goes quiet. Not sleep, not the wolves going out. Something else, a stillness that is not rest but is not wakefulness either. And then the dark comes, and I am present again, completely and immediately, as if I had never been anywhere else. The village does not know yet. I am careful. I have always been careful. This is not a new skill, only applied to a new situation. The window I keep closed now, both latches, both sides. On the last night I will write about in this account, because the account is becoming something that should not exist in a house where someone might find it. I stood at the edge of the village in the place I always stood, the tree line, the dark between the pines, the particular smell of the country beyond, and I felt the thing I have always felt there, the pull of the dark country, the pull of what moves in it, and what I was when I moved in it. And I felt something else now too, not a pull, a recognition, the dark country recognizing me back, differently than before, as if I had been a visitor for 11 years and was now, for the first time, something more like a resident. I stood at the tree line for a long time. I thought about the village behind me, the 100 small lives in the dark, the breathe. I thought about patience, which is easier to practice now than it used to be, because I have more of it now than I used to have, and what I have now does not run out. I went back to the house. I closed the window. I waited for the dark to come in its new way, the way it comes now completely, all at once, with no in-between, as if the dark and I had reached an arrangement about how this would go. My father told this story differently each time, which is how I knew it was true. Not the details, those stayed fixed, anchored to what he had witnessed, rather than what he had invented. The Pampas, light at certain hours, that flat gold before the sun fully dropped below the horizon, the smell of the grasses after rain moved through, the particular way his grandfather stood at the fence line at dusk with his back to the house, watching something that had not yet arrived at the far edge of the field. Those details never changed across the versions. What changed was the frame around them, the lesson my father drew, which shifted across the years of my childhood from cautionary tale to family history to something he simply stopped framing at all, somewhere around the time I turned 30 and my husband and I started discussing children. He never told me directly that I should count them. He would begin, when he told it with any seriousness, with the birth. My great-grandmother's 7th delivery. A boy, born in the night, in the late 1920s, somewhere in the province of Buenos Aires on an estancia that no longer exists in the form he remembered it. The boy came out with a mark on his lower back. Not a wound, a dark stain on the skin, roughly circular, that the women in the room recognized before anyone spoke. My great-grandmother had recognized it herself, or so my father believed. She was silent for too long after the birth, and when she finally held the child, she held him the way you hold something you intend to keep, but know will require decisions you have not yet made. The mark was what the old families in that province called the seal del lobizn, the 7th son mark. In that community, among those families, it was known, not spoken of openly, not explained to children or neighbors or to the priest, if the priest was the kind of priest who would ask too many questions, but known the way a family knows its own debts, quietly, precisely, carried by the women who managed these things across generations, passed from the ones who understood to the ones who would need to. My great-grandfather was a 7th son, the 7th son of a 7th son. The mark on his back confirmed what the Count had already established. They kept him. This is the part of the story I spent years thinking I understood and did not. What keeping him meant, in practice, was a set of household arrangements so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of daily life that my father didn't realize until much later that they had been arrangements at all. Certain outer doors locked from the outside after 10 at night, with the key held by my great-grandmother and later by her eldest daughter. A shed at the far edge of the property that was never used for storage, that contained only a heavy cot, a water jug, and a crucifix nailed at the eye level of a standing man. Weeks during which my great-grandfather spent 3 or 4 nights in the shed voluntarily, calmly, without discussion, the way a man goes for a long walk when he needs to think. Certain saints' days observed with specific attention, Certain windows left unlatched only on the west-facing side, where the fields began. None of it explained. It was simply how the house operated. Children learn a house by moving through it, and my father moved through that house for 17 years and learned its shape, including the shape of these arrangements, without ever thinking to name what he was learning. He carried the shape without its name until after his grandfather died, and the shed was emptied, and the doors were changed back, and the windows reset. And then, only then, did he notice that what had been reset had ever been anything other than standard theory. He was not a frightening man. My father loved him. This is the part I need to say clearly, because it is the part that is hardest to carry. There was no monster. There was a man who kept his nails trimmed short and his hair cut close to the head. A man who was careful about the way he looked at strangers and at dogs and at the horses when they were unsettled. A man with strong opinions about weather and no opinions at all about politics, who sat with you when you were troubled and said nothing until the trouble had eased of its own weight. That particular attentiveness, that quality of noticing what others hadn't yet said, I have always recognized in my father. I see it in myself. I see it, sometimes, when I watch my eldest. After the funeral, they cleaned out the shed. Under the cot, in a wooden box nailed shut with old nails that had rusted into the wood, a wolfskin belt. Stiff, dark, wrapped in cloth that had rotted away from the edges but still held the center. No one touched it directly. My father's uncle carried it on the end of a garden rake to the priest, and the priest asked no questions and buried it himself in ground that was not consecrated, and the family never asked where. My father also told me this, that in the months before his grandfather died, the months when the old man was already weakened and rarely left the house, there were still mornings when someone would find the outer doors locked from the outside. Locked from outside. The key on its hook in the kitchen, inside, where it had always been kept. I asked my father once how that was possible. He said he had stopped asking. I am the third child of 4. My father has 2 brothers. His father was the 4th of 8. I have 3 children. I am expecting my 4th. My father called 2 weeks ago. He asked how the pregnancy was going. He asked if we knew the sex yet. I said we didn't, still too early. He was quiet for a moment in the way he is quiet when he is thinking about something he has decided not to say. Then he said, lightly, in the tone of a man making casual conversation, probably a boy. I didn't ask him why he thought so. My eldest son has a mark on his lower back. He has had it since birth. His pediatrician described it to me twice, a Mongolian spot, common in children of certain backgrounds, typically fades by school age. He is 11 years old. It has not faded. I had not thought about the mark in years. I have been thinking about it now for 2 weeks. I went back and looked at the photographs from his first months. The mark is there, clearly, in the hospital photograph. It has always been there. It is roughly circular. My father has seen those photographs. He has visited enough times over the past 11 years to have seen the mark itself, in summer, when the boy went without a shirt. My father has never said anything about it. What I keep returning to is a word. My father used it once to describe how his grandfather approached the shed, the nights, the arrangement the family had built around him over decades. Not the shed itself, not what the nights required. The choosing of it, the long practice of choosing it, year after year, until choice had become habit and habit had become character. My father said he accommodated it, not suffered, not endured, accommodated. The way you accommodate a weather pattern you cannot change, a field that floods reliably each spring, a road that is impassable 3 months of the year. You organize your life in the space around it. You call that space your life. After enough years, it simply is your life, and the arrangement inside it has become so familiar that it has become invisible, which is the only way it can be sustained across a lifetime. My great-grandfather lived into his 80s. He died in the house he was born in, surrounded by family, in a room where the window latches had been replaced at some point with a model that locked from both sides. My father noticed the latches at the funeral. He mentioned them to no one. My father is coming to visit next month. He wants to see the children before the baby arrives. This is reasonable. He will sit at the kitchen table and be present in the way he has always been, attentive, unhurried, noticing things. I have been thinking, in the part of my thinking I have not shared with my husband, about what I will do if he watches my son differently from my daughters, whether I will say something, whether I will pretend not to notice, whether it will matter what I do. Last week I checked that the back door locks properly. I found myself noticing which windows face west. I stood in the hallway for a few minutes after the children were in bed, listening to the house settle, before I understood that I was listening and went back to bed. There is an accommodation you make when you begin acting on something you have not admitted to believing. It is very quiet. It looks, from the outside and from the inside both, like ordinary precaution. You are simply a person who pays attention to locks, a person who notices which rooms face which direction, a person who checks on a sleeping child who is sleeping peacefully and does not need to be checked on, because you are a careful parent, and there is nothing wrong with being careful. My father never told me to count. He didn't have to. I left the valley when I was 18, and I did not go back for 30 years. That is not unusual for people who grow up in small communities and leave. There is always a logic to the distance, always reasons that accumulate into decades before you notice. Work, the city, the particular relief of being somewhere that does not know your family's history. My mother's death brought me back, as these things tend to. A small funeral, by necessity, she had outlived most of the people who would have attended, and those who remained were old enough that the drive was difficult. In the end it was me, my 2 cousins from the eastern side of the valley, and a woman named Ingrid who had been my mother's neighbor for 40 years, and who stood at the graveside with her hands folded and her eyes dry in a way that seemed like strength rather than absence. I had not stood at a graveside in that valley since I was 8 years old. The thing I should explain, before I explain anything else, is that it was not a secret. What the community knew about the wolf, what the adults had always known, what the children absorbed without being told explicitly, was not kept hidden in the way that shameful things are kept hidden. It was simply not discussed with outsiders, because there was no framework outsiders would recognize, and because the arrangement had lasted long enough that no one felt it required explanation. It was part of the landscape. You learned it the way you learned which fields flooded in spring, which roads became impassable in winter. It was a condition of the place. At every burial in that valley, within living memory and beyond it according to the oldest members of the community, a wolf came to the gravesite. Not wolves, a wolf. Always one. Always the same position at the edge of the graveyard. Always the same distance from the grave itself, as if that distance were fixed by a rule no one had written down but everyone respected. It came in the night, after the mourners had left. It stayed until before dawn, and then it was gone. My father, when I was young enough to ask directly about things without understanding why questions had limits, told me that it came to make sure they did it right. I asked what doing it right meant. He said, "You'll understand when you're older." This was not evasion, he meant it. The understanding was something that came with time, not explanation.
My grandfather died when I was 8, in June, a clear summer. The funeral was in the afternoon, and the graveside service was brief. Afterward, the community gathered at the house, and there was food, and the kind of easy grief that comes with a life fully lived. I remember the light lasting until very late, as it does in Norway in summer, and the adults staying on the porch long into the evening.
The elders left for the graveyard around 11. I was not supposed to notice this, but I did, because children notice when adults move with a particular quiet purpose. My father went with them. He told me to stay with my mother and my aunts. I did not stay. I followed at a distance I thought was sufficient.
Yeah?
The graveyard was at the top of a small rise, bordered by a low stone wall and a line of birches that marked the tree line. I stopped at the wall. The adults were arranged in a loose group near my grandfather's grave, speaking in low voices. They had brought lanterns but kept them low. Beyond them, at the far edge of the graveyard where the birches began, I could see the shape of the wolf. It was sitting. That is the word that comes first, even now sitting, the way a dog sits when it is waiting, patient and still. It was very large. Even at that distance and in that light, I understood that it was larger than any wolf I had seen in photographs. Its eyes caught the lantern light and held it in the way animals' eyes do, except that what I saw in them, even from that distance, was not the flat reflective gleam of an animal. It was something with more depth to it, something that was paying a specific kind of attention. The adults did not react to it. They continued their low conversation, their small gestures of comfort to one another, their ordinary grief. After some time, one of the older men, a farmer named Bjornstad, who had lived in the valley his entire life, separated from the group and walked toward the edge of the graveyard, not to the wolf. He stopped perhaps 10 meters from it and stood there, facing it, for what I estimated at the time as a very long time, and would now estimate as 15 or 20 minutes. He did not speak, as far as I could tell. He stood. The wolf sat, then Bjornstad walked back to the group. He died 2 years later. I did not attend that burial. I was already gone by then. What I took away from that night, the understanding that came without explanation, that my father had promised would come with time, was not exactly what I expected. I had expected a framework, a story that explained the arrangement, the compact, whatever contract the valley had made with whatever the wolf was. But what settled into me over the years was not a framework. It was a feeling, a sense of proportion, of something old and present and entirely indifferent to whether I understood it or not, which had its own schedule and its own purposes, and which the community had long ago decided it was more sensible to accommodate than to resist or to fear. I found this, as I got older, and thought about it in the way adults think about the things that mark them, not frightening, or not only frightening. There was something in it that felt, if not exactly right, then at least honest. The valley had made no pretense. The arrangement was what it was. The wolf came and was given its distance and its time, and in exchange for what exactly, I was never told. Things continued. People died in their time rather than before it. The fields did what fields do. The arrangement helped. My mother's burial was small, as I said. We left the graveside at dusk, which was earlier than I would have liked, but Ingrid needed to get home before the road darkened and my cousins had a long drive. I stood at the grave for a few minutes after they walked away, alone, listening to the valley. I did not see the wolf. I drove back to the house and ate the food Ingrid had left and went to bed early. At some point in the night I woke. The room was dark. I lay still and listened to the sound of the valley at night, the wind off the Highland, the distant sound of water, and I thought about Bjornstad walking to the edge of the graveyard, what he had done when he got there, what the standing had meant, whether it was something anyone had taught him or something he had understood on his own about what was required. I thought about whether anyone had known to do that last night. In the morning I drove to the graveyard before the others were awake. The sky was still grey. I walked to my mother's grave and stood for a moment, and then, because I found I needed to, walked to the far edge of the graveyard where the birches began. The ground near the tree line is soft there, even in dry weather, where the shade keeps the moisture. I looked at it for a long time. There was a depression in the grass, not deep, not dramatic, the oval shape of something large that had sat in that position for some hours, and then risen and left before the light came. The position was exactly where I remembered. I drove south later that day. I had been in the valley for 4 days, which was as long as my schedule allowed, and there was nothing more I could do there. The house would be handled by the lawyer. The few things of my mother's that I wanted, I had taken. I have thought many times since then about what Bjornstad knew that I don't, whether it was taught or inherited or simply understood after enough years of standing in that valley, whether the standing itself was sufficient, or whether there was something specific in it, a posture, a duration, a particular quality of attention that the arrangement required. I don't know what it expected from us last night. I don't know if what we gave or failed to give will matter. I only know that the grass was flattened in the right place, that whatever came, came, and that it left before dawn, the way it always has, the way the oldest members of that community understood it would. Whether it was satisfied, I cannot tell you. I didn't stay long enough to know. These notes will not be filed. I am writing them because the case will not leave me, and because I have found, after 30 years of practice, that cases which will not leave tend to become manageable once written. This has been my experience. I am writing these notes on that basis, and I will decide afterward what to do with them. The patient, George H., farmer, 63 years of age at first presentation, resident of a village in the Landsberg district. Referred to me in the autumn of 1891 by the parish physician who was retiring from practice. Clean record of health until his 50s, no significant history. His wife accompanied him to the first appointment. She sat in the chair beside the examining table and folded her hands and watched him with the particular attention of a woman who has spent a great many years watching someone very carefully. His complaint, at first presentation, was wounds. Cuts, specifically appearing on the forearms and occasionally the lateral torso in the night, for which he could not account. Not deep wounds. Clean-edged. They were always healed to a day's age by the time he noticed them in the morning, as if they had been made the night before and the body had already begun its work. He had no memory of injuring himself. He slept, he said, heavily, always had. He would wake and find the cuts and look at them and dress them himself before his wife woke. His wife, I noted, did not appear surprised by any of this. She confirmed the timeline with small nods and offered no additional information. I found, upon examination, something I could not immediately classify. The subcutaneous tissue of the forearms and, less markedly, across the upper back, presented with an unusual density when palpated. Not hardness, exactly. Resistance, as if something beneath the ordinary layers of muscle and fat was compressed there, or layered there. Or I am choosing my words carefully, as if something additional occupied the space between the skin and the deeper tissue. When I pressed with my fingers, I found the normal give of a man's arm, but a fraction of a second later than expected, and accompanied by a sensation I can only describe as two surfaces meeting where there should have been one. I noted this in my examination record as subcutaneous tissue irregularity, possible fibrotic origin. I have since removed that record. I treated him for 4 years. The cuts continued on a rhythm I eventually recognized as tied, loosely, to the period between the new moon and the dark of the following, not the full moon, which would have been too obvious to mean anything, but the darker half of the cycle, the nights when the village was least lit. They were worse in winter. In summer, there were sometimes weeks with no new wounds at all. During the second year of treatment, he told me, without my asking, that he had spoken to Father Miller. He did not elaborate on what he had said to Father Miller or what Father Miller had said to him, except to tell me that the priest had given him instruction and that he had followed the instruction, and that since following it, the wounds were less frequent. I asked what the instruction was. He said it was not relevant to the medical case. His wife's hands tightened slightly in her lap. I did not ask again. Over the 4 years, I came to know him in the way a physician knows a patient he sees regularly and finds interesting, not in the clinical sense only, but in the fuller sense, the sense that admits a person's quality as distinct from their symptoms. He was careful. That is the word I return to. He was careful in a way that most men are not careful about the way he moved, the way he looked at things, the amount of space he occupied. He kept his nails cut very short. He carried himself with a deliberateness that was not stiffness, but something more like precision. He knew exactly where his hands were at all times. He was not frightening. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. He was not frightening. He was, in fact, among the more pleasant people I saw in those years. He listened well. He had a quality of attention that made you feel, in his presence, that whatever you were saying was the thing most worth saying. His wife, who had clearly lived beside this quality for 30 years, showed no signs of fear. She showed signs of vigilance. These are different things. He died in the winter of 1895. Heart failure, advanced age, entirely natural. I was called to the house to certify, which I did. The family was quiet. The wife thanked me with the same careful composure she had always shown. I expressed my condolences and collected my bag and was nearly to the door when the eldest son appeared and asked, in a low voice, whether I would mind coming downstairs. There was something in the cellar they had found, and they did not know who else to call. The cellar was dry and well kept. In the far corner, beneath a section of flooring that had been laid over rather than nailed down, they had found a wooden box. The box was old, much older than the patient, older perhaps than the house. Inside the box, wrapped in cloth that had become part of what it wrapped, was a wolfskin. I examined it with the same procedure I apply to anything uncertain. I observed before I touched, and I touched as little as possible, and I noted what I observed. It was warm. This is the fact I cannot account for, and I am a man who requires accounts. I had expected cold. The cellar was cold, the floor was cold, the wooden box was cold to the touch, the cloth wrapping was cold. The wolfskin itself, when I touched its edge with my probe, was warm in the way that living tissue is warm. Not room warm, body warm, the way the skin of a sleeping animal is warm. The hair on it moved. I am not certain what moved it. The cellar was not drafty in that corner. My lantern was steady, the hair thick, grey-brown. The coat of a large wolf moved in a slow wave across the surface of the pelt, from the head end toward the tail, as if something beneath it were breathing. I watched this for what I estimate was 2 minutes. Then I stepped back. The family was watching me from the stairs. I told them it should be taken to Father Miller. The eldest son nodded as if he had expected this. I learned later, from the parish record, that Father Miller buried it in private, in ground he did not identify in his notes the following week. I have begun these private notes 3 times since the autumn. Each time I have written them and then burned them, because the writing did not produce what I expected it to produce. I expected the writing to resolve something, to give the events the clean edges of a documented case, and therefore remove them from the category of things I carry without filing. Instead, the writing returns me, each time, to the examination room, to the forearm under my fingers, to the moment of delay, the fraction of a second between pressure and the expected give of the tissue, to what lay in that delay, to my first note, subcutaneous tissue irregularity, possible fibrotic origin. I knew when I wrote it that it was insufficient. I wrote it anyway because it was the most honest language I had for what I had felt, which was that the tissue beneath the skin of that man's arm was not alone. I have pressed my own forearm many times in the months since. I press it now as I write fingers there, applying measured pressure, waiting for the give. It comes when it should, at the depth it should, from tissue that is exactly what tissue is. I am an ordinary man. I have the forearm of an ordinary man. This is what my fingers tell me, each time. I do not know why it is not a relief. I do not know what I would do if the give, one day, came a fraction of a second late. I will not file these notes. November 28th, 1692. I set these down privately, not for the record of this parish, which I keep with all care and which no man will find cause to question. This account is separate. I do not yet know what it is for. Caleb Marsh came to me this morning before the first service. He is a trapper by trade and a deacon's man by habit, reliable in both capacities, not given to superstition in the way of some. He came with his hat in his hands and asked to speak privately. I took him into the study. He said he had found tracks, petit earliest slave. He described them with a trapper's precision, which I found myself grateful for, because precision is the thing I most needed, and the thing I was least prepared for. The tracks were wolf prints, large ones, large enough to cause him to measure them, which he did, noting the result in the margin of his account book before coming to me. The stride and breadth were consistent with a large male wolf. The depth was consistent with an animal of considerable weight. What was not consistent, there was no tail drag. A wolf moving through snow of that depth at any pace leaves the mark of its tail in the snow between the rear prints. It is not a dramatic mark, but it is invariable. Caleb has trapped in these woods for 22 years and has seen thousands of wolf tracks and has never once failed to find the tail mark in fresh powder. He found no tail mark. He went back and checked twice. He also found, In one section of the trail where the animal had slowed near the creek crossing at Miller's Run, that the rear left print was shallower than the rear right, a drag on that leg or a shortening of that leg's stride, consistent with a limp. I asked him what he made of it. He said he made nothing of it. He said he had come to me because he made nothing of it and could not make nothing of it any longer. He then said something else. He said he had measured the stride against a man's stride, and that the correspondence was close enough to disturb him, and that the man whose stride it corresponded to was someone I would know from Sunday services, and that he sat in the third pew on the left side, and that this man had walked with a limp on the left side since a hunting injury 3 winters past. He would not give me the name. I told him to go home. I told him this was not a thing I could act upon without evidence, and that I would pray on it, and that he should as well. He left. I sat at my desk for some time. Then I went to the church and stood in the doorway and looked at the third pew. December 4th. I have been thinking about the signs. There is no scriptural authority for what I am considering, and yet the continental literature on this subject, which I have read only in the context of theological study, with no credence given, describes certain markers by which the afflicted may be recognized in their ordinary form. An unibrow, meeting above the bridge of the nose, curved nails with a particular set to the cuticle, eyes that carry a certain quality in direct light, hands held in a specific way when the person believes themselves unobserved. I told myself this morning that I was reviewing this literature as an exercise in understanding the boundary between superstition and genuine heresy, which is the business of any minister. This is what I told myself. I am recording that I told myself this, and that I do not entirely believe it. During the sermon this morning I found that I could not stop looking at the third pew. The man was present. He was attentive. He sang when we sang. He held his hands in his lap in the way a man holds his hands in his lap in church. I could not see his nails from the pulpit. December 9th. Caleb Marsh has not been at services for 5 days. His wife says he went north to check his snares on the 3rd. He has not returned. This is not in itself alarming. Men who go north to check snares are sometimes absent for more than a week. The weather has been difficult. I am recording it because it is the kind of fact that should be recorded even when it means nothing. December 11th. I have found, in reviewing my memory of the congregation across the years of my ministry here, 3 men besides the one Caleb indicated whose eyebrows meet above the nose. 2 of them are brothers. The 3rd is a farmer who lives on the East Road. I do not know what to do with this information. I am recording it because the writing is the only thing I have found that keeps my thoughts from moving in circles. December 15th. I stood near the door after service and watched people's hands as they left. This is a thing I did not plan to do. I found myself doing it and did not stop. The man from the third pew, I will not write his name here, wore gloves despite the warmth of the building. He had worn gloves through the entire service. I do not know if this is significant. December 19th. Caleb Marsh has been gone for 16 days. I have prayed for him. I have also been asking, quietly, whether anyone has seen him north of the village, and no one has. His wife is beginning to show the first signs of alarm that she has thus far successfully contained. The man from the third pew stopped me in the yard after service today. He asked whether I had heard anything of Caleb, and whether it was true he had gone north. And he asked these questions in a tone of ordinary neighborly concern, which is the tone in which such questions are always asked. I told him I had heard nothing. He nodded. He was wearing gloves again. He wished me a good day and walked away. When he was perhaps 20 feet distant, he stopped and looked back at me. Not sharply, not with any expression I could name. He simply turned and looked, and held the look until I nodded, and then turned back and walked on. I realized, standing in the yard, that I had looked away first. December 24th. I have been reviewing the signs for 3 weeks. I have narrowed my list. I have not told anyone I have been keeping a list. I do not know who I would tell, or what telling would accomplish, or what I would say. I am a minister of the gospel, not a witch-finder. Those proceedings in Salem I have believed from the beginning to be a catastrophe of fear, and I have said so to my congregation, and I stand by it. I will not be the kind of man who looks at his neighbor and sees a monster. And yet I have been looking. There is a thing that happens when you begin looking for something specific in a face you have known for years. The face does not change, but your knowledge of it does. What was unremarkable becomes freighted. Every ordinary gesture, the way the man shifts his weight during the long prayers, the way he tilts his head when he is listening, the way he holds his mouth when he is not speaking, becomes a thing you are reading rather than seeing. You can no longer see without reading. This is the condition I am in, and I do not know how to leave it. January 3rd, 1693. Caleb Marsh has been declared missing by his family. The constable has made inquiries. No sign of him north of the village or anywhere else. His snare lines were found empty and undisturbed, as if he had never reached them. I went to the tracks finally. I went alone, early in the morning, before the light was full. They are 3 miles north on the logging road, and then a quarter mile into the trees. The snow has been fresh twice since Caleb found them, and the original prints are gone. I stood in the place where he said he had found them, and looked at the trees, and listened to the silence, and then I walked back. On my way back, I passed the creek at Miller's Run, the crossing Caleb had described. I looked at the snow and found new prints, more recent, which had not been there when he first came to me. Large, no tail drag, left rear slightly shallower than the right. I measured the stride. I am not going to write down the measurement. January 10th. I fell asleep in my chair at the desk last night. When I woke, both candles were out and the door of the study stood open. I do not know who opened it. I am the only person in this house. I have been praying for the capacity to disbelieve what I have observed. This is a strange prayer, and I know it. I have not yet received an answer I find adequate. January 14th. I came here to study habitat range, large predator movement across the subarctic tree line, seasonal variation in wolf pack territories, the relationship between prey migration and predator follow-through. Systematic work, the kind that requires patience and produces data rather than conclusions, and which I prefer for exactly that reason. I have been keeping this separate journal since the 4th week, when I realized that what I was observing would not fit cleanly into my official record, and that my official record is a document I intend to stand behind. October 18th. Found the tracks for the first time. I had been following a set of ordinary wolf prints, mid-sized pack, 4 animals, heading northwest along the river. The prints were unremarkable. Then crossing the pack's trail from the east, a second set of prints, a single animal. I noticed the size immediately and stopped. Wolf prints vary significantly. I have measured hundreds of them in this and previous expeditions. The largest I had previously encountered measured 11 centimeters across the pad, left forefoot, a mature male in the Arkhangelsk region, an exceptional specimen by any standard. These prints measured 15 centimeters across. I measured twice and checked the instrument. The depth was what stopped me. The ground along the river at this point is silt-mixed soil, semi-frozen at the surface with a loose layer beneath. My probe penetrates it to approximately 5 centimeters before meeting significant resistance. This is standard for the conditions and the season. The prints I was examining were 9 inches deep. I converted the measurement and recorded it, and then stood and looked at the surrounding ground for a long time. 9 inches into material that my probe could not penetrate beyond 5 centimeters. Whatever made these prints was not heavier than any recorded wolf by a degree of variation. It was heavier by an order that did not resolve when I tried to calculate it. I followed the tracks east for 2 hours and then lost them at a section of exposed rock. October 21st. I met the shepherd 3 days after finding the prints, which I note because the meeting felt, in retrospect, like a natural consequence of having found them, as if the landscape had decided I was now someone the shepherd needed to know about. His name is Pavo. He has grazed sheep on this plateau for 40 years. He is perhaps 70, perhaps older. He has the quality of total ease with the environment that comes only from decades of attention to it, the way he reads the sky, the way he notes the behavior of his animals without appearing to watch them. He offered me coffee from his fire, and I accepted, and we talked for a while about the weather and the reindeer herds. I showed him my measurements of the tracks. He looked at them for a moment. He nodded. I asked if he had seen the animal that made them. He said, yes, many times. I asked how long it had been in this territory. He said, my father knew it. His father too, probably. I asked if it was dangerous. He considered this in the way of a man who finds the question to be the wrong shape for what he knows. Then he said, not to me. I asked why not. He said, I don't bother it. Long pause. He poured more coffee. He said, it doesn't bother me. This is how it is. October 27th. I have been trying to obtain useful data from Pavo for a week. This is more difficult than it sounds, not because he is unwilling to speak, but because his answers consistently fail to be the kind of answers that can be entered into a record. I asked him what direction it traveled. He said, when it wants. I asked him what time of day it was most often visible. He said, when it decides. I asked him what its territory boundary appeared to be. He looked at me with the patience of a man watching a child attempt a task slightly beyond them and said, I don't think it has one. I asked him if he had ever tracked it. He said, track it where? I wrote this down. I have been writing everything down. What I have noticed, reviewing these notes, is that Pavo's relationship with the animal is of the same kind as his relationship with the weather, or the river, or the angle of the sun in November. He accounts for it. He works around it. He treats it as a condition of the place, as real and as unamenable to reduction as the cold. This is not fear. It is not reverence. It is something older than either of those things and much harder to name. November 3rd. I set up an observation position at the tree line, northern exposure, where the prints have appeared most consistently. I have spent 3 nights there. The second night was very cold, -22, which requires attention, and which I gave the temperature rather than the darkness. The third night the prints appeared. I had my lantern, I had my instruments. I was awake and alert, and I was looking in the direction from which, based on all prior track evidence, the animal would have come. The prints appeared in the snow to my left, in the area I was not watching, as if they had always been there and I had only now noticed them. They came from the tree line, passed within 40 meters of my position, and continued into the darkness to the northeast. I could not find the source. I held my lantern toward the tracks. The tracks were fresh, the edges still crisp, no wind fill made within the previous minutes. I swept the lantern across the area between myself and the tree line. There was nothing there. I swept it across the area in the direction the tracks continued. There was nothing there. 40 meters is not a great distance. The lantern reaches 40 meters easily in clear air, and the air was clear. I followed the tracks with the lantern's light and could not find what made them. I noted the depth, 9 inches, consistent with previous measurements. I noted the time, 11:40 in the evening. I noted the temperature. I noted that I had been watching the correct direction and that nothing had passed through my field of observation and that the tracks existed regardless. November 7th. I went to Pavo the following morning and told him what I had observed. He listened without interrupting, which is his way. When I had finished, he nodded once, the nod of a man receiving information that confirms rather than surprises. He said, "Yes, that's right." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't. This is how it is." I asked him how long it had been this way, whether it had always been like this, whether his father and grandfather had had the same experience of sometimes seeing it and sometimes not. He thought about this. He said, "I think it's always been like this. I think it was like this before us." He paused. He said, "I think it will be like this after." He said this with no particular emotion. It was a statement of geography, of the properties of a place he had lived in his entire life. The same tone he used to describe the river ice or the reindeer routes. What is there is there. What will be there will be there. I have been trying to write up my official field notes for this section of the survey. I have the measurements, they are accurate. I have the dates and the positions and the weather conditions and all the information that makes a set of field notes legitimate. What I do not have is an explanation for the measurements that I can submit with any confidence that it will be received as science rather than as something else. 9 inches. Into ground my probe cannot penetrate beyond 5 centimeters. On 3 separate occasions, each confirmed with the same instrument, each giving the same result. I cannot explain this. I can submit the measurements without conclusions. I have done this before on fieldwork that produced anomalous results, submitted the data, and allowed others to draw what conclusions they could. This is good practice. It is honest. What I cannot submit, and what I will keep in this separate journal, is what I thought about on the walk back from Pavo's fire on the morning of November 8th. I walked north along the river, and the sun was very low, and the cold was complete. And I thought about what Pavo had said, that it was like this before us, that it would be like this after. I thought about the size of the prints. I thought about the weight those prints implied, the weight that defied what I could calculate. I thought about standing 40 meters from something in clear air with a good lantern and seeing only the tracks it left. I thought about what it must mean to be something that old, that heavy, that present, and to have no interest in whether I was here or not, to have no framework in which I registered as relevant, to be so entirely outside the scale of things that concerned it that I was not prey, not threat, not curiosity, simply not a category. I have studied large predators for 15 years. I understand their relationship to the things they hunt and the things they avoid. I understand being noticed by something that is evaluating you. I know what that feels like. This did not feel like that. The cold was constant. The tracks were in the snow. I walked back to my camp and wrote everything down. The prints will still be there in the morning. They will be there in the spring when I am gone. They will be there, I think, in some form, when no one living now is left to measure them. That is the note I cannot file. These notes are separate from the official correspondence, and will remain so. What follows is the account I have not sent to Paris, because Paris has already received what Paris required, and what Paris required was a conclusion rather than a record. I write this for myself. I do not know yet what I will do with it. I am a lieutenant of the Provincial Guard. I have been stationed in the Gvarden since March of this year. I have read the prior reports. I have reviewed the evidence collected during the royal hunts. I have been present at the examination of the animals killed and displayed as resolutions to this affair. And I know as well as any man in this province what the official position is and how much of it I believe. What I cannot put in my official correspondence is the farmstead. The Fabre family has occupied a stone farmhouse on the eastern slope of the Trier Valley for at least 3 generations. The father is named Tien, his wife Marguerite, 3 children. The farmhouse is solidly built, better than most in this district, thick walls, heavy shutters, a door that is braced from inside with an iron bar the father made himself after the second visit. The first visit was in late January. The creature approached the house from the tree line to the north, covered the distance to the front wall perhaps 15 meters, and stopped. It stayed at that position, which I have since measured at 9 meters from the door, for the remaining hours of the night. At dawn it was gone. The family had been awake from the time the dogs began their behavior. The dogs were silent for the duration of the creature's presence, not the silence of animals that have accepted the situation, but the silence of animals that have assessed the situation and determined that there is nothing useful to do. On the second visit in February, Tien Fabre fired his musket through the shutter in the direction of the shape he could see through the gap. He does not know if the shot struck. The creature remained at its position for the rest of the night and withdrew at dawn as before. I have these details from Tien's account, which I took myself in April when I arrived and began making inquiries beyond the official ones. He is not a man who embellishes. He told me what happened the way you tell a man what the weather was on a given day. But well, by the time I arrived, there had been 4 visits. I learned of the farmstead through a reference in a neighbor's account that the official correspondence had not pursued. I went there and I spoke to the family, and then I established a surveillance position on the hill above the property, and I waited. The 5th visit was in the first week of May. I have written official observations before. I have documented things I did not expect to document, and I have found that documentation is a discipline that keeps the mind from doing things that are less useful. I applied this discipline on the night of the 5th visit, and I am applying it now. The creature emerged from the tree line at approximately 10:30 in the evening. I was positioned on the hill, above and to the northeast, with a clear angle on the farmhouse and the approach from the north. The night was clear. There was sufficient moonlight for observation. It was large. I will not say how large, because the figure I would write is one I have already written privately and then removed, because figures require comparison to known quantities, and there were no known quantities I found adequate. It moved from the tree line to its established position 9 meters from the door, in a time inconsistent with any natural animal's deliberate approach. Not quickly. There was no urgency in its movement, but it covered the ground in a way that left me uncertain, afterward, how many steps I had seen it take. At 9 meters from the door it stopped. It stood there for 6 hours. I have thought about how to describe 6 hours of this, and I have concluded that description is not available. There is no event to describe. The farmhouse was dark. The family extinguished all lights on the first visit, and has not lit them during any subsequent visit. The creature stood at 9 meters from the door, and did not advance, and did not retreat, and did not circle the house, and did not test the shutters or the door, and did not make any sound I was able to hear from my position. It stood with a patience that I found, and continue to find, more disturbing than anything else in this account. I have written about aggressive animals. I have written about predators in the moment of hunt. I know what that looks like, and what it produces in an observer, which is a recognizable form of fear with specific physical coordinates. This was not that. This produced something different, something that has no good official language, which is one of the reasons it is not in the official correspondence. The creature was not hunting the farmstead. It was not testing it. It was not attempting to gain entry, and it has never attempted to gain entry across 6 visits that I am aware of, and possibly more before I arrived. It was waiting. I went back to the family after the 5th visit. Tien Fabre met me at the door in the morning with the expression of a man who has had a long night and is not surprised to see me. I told him what I had observed. He nodded. I asked him if the creature had always maintained the same position. He said, always the same. I asked him if he had any understanding of what it was waiting for. He was quiet for a time. Then he said that on the fourth visit, the longest visit before the fifth, he had stood at the door for a while, not outside at the door, with his hand on the bar, listening. He said he had the sense, standing there, that whatever was on the other side of the door also knew he was standing there, that it was aware of the door between them in the specific sense of knowing he was at it. He did not open the door. He eventually went back to his wife and children and lay down and did not sleep. I asked him what he thought would happen if he opened the door. He said he did not know. He said that was not what stopped him. I did not ask him what stopped him. I found that I did not want to know. The sixth visit was in early October, which is the visit I consider the significant one, and the one I have thought about most in the weeks since. I was not present for the sixth visit. I had been called to Mende for a period of 3 weeks on other business. I learned the details from Tien when I returned. The sixth visit followed the same pattern. Same time, same approach from the north, same position, same duration until dawn. Tien confirmed all of this in his account, and then he told me the thing I could not put in my official correspondence. He did not board the shutters before the creature arrived. He had boarded them on every previous visit. On the sixth he had prepared to board them, the boards were ready, the tools beside the window, and then he had stood with the first board in his hands for a while, looking at the window, and then he had set it down. I asked him why. He looked at me with the specific expression of a man who has thought about something so long that the thinking has exhausted itself, and he is now on the other side of it, in the territory where the question no longer has the same weight it did. He said, "It comes every time." He said, "It has not hurt us." He said, "I thought perhaps it was time to let it know we understand that." I am being recalled to Lyon at the end of the month. The official position on the Beast of Gvarden is settled, or settled enough that my presence in this district is no longer required, and the provincial guard has other business elsewhere. This is reasonable. The assignment here was always temporary. I have not told Tien Fabre that I am leaving. I have thought about why I have not told him, and I have arrived at the following, because to tell him would require me to also tell him what I think will happen after I leave, which is that the visits will continue, and that the creature will come back in November and December and through the winter as it has come back each time before, and that it will stand at 9 meters from the door with its particular patience, and that Tien will not board the shutters, and that whatever understanding is developing between the farmstead and the creature will continue to develop in whatever direction it is developing, without me, without the provincial guard, without Paris, without any authority I represent or have ever represented. The creature has been patient for 10 months. It has asked nothing. It has taken nothing. It has only returned, and stood, and waited, and withdrawn before dawn. I do not know what it is waiting for. I do not know if what it is waiting for is approaching, or has already arrived. I leave on Thursday.